Regardless, though, it seems that yes, the mood here is pretty lively. However, it does appear calm as of right now. We haven't seen any physical altercations. The other thing I do want to point out right now, Mike, is that besides the group of onlookers over here, you've also got a whole group of media reporters looking to cover this historic story. I'm just going to ask my photographer, Phil, to pan over to our left over here, and you can see, or rather to my right, and you can see this is just a fraction of the cameras and the journalists that are looking to capture this story just a block away from us on this intersection of Hogan Place and Center Street. You've got even more reporters who want to grab some visuals of the former president heading into the courthouse again for this historic arraignment. This is a story that has grabbed international headlines, not just national headlines. All of us waiting to see how this will all unfold later on today. Mike.
Madeline, it's worth noting that Congress is out for the Easter Passover break. Have you spotted any lawmakers, either supporters or people who oppose President Trump up there in Manhattan?
We do know that Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene led a protest earlier this morning at a park located across the street from the courthouse. Many people were there, probably the largest group of demonstrations, largest demonstration that we have seen so far over the last few weeks that we have been covering this story. Again, it was peaceful, although we did hear from one of the producers who was monitoring that rally that there was a physical altercation between two people. But for the most part, Mike, it was peaceful. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene was not the only member of Congress to be here today. We also know that Congressman George Santos came here to show support for the former president. Mike?
And security seems very tight. Does it feel like a very secure situation outside the courthouse at this hour, Maddie?
It does, and the NYPD has been preparing for this type of scenario for weeks. The NYPD has issued a stand-ready order for all its officers ready to be deployed if necessary. However, New York City Mayor says they've been monitoring all scenarios, and they say that there was no credible threat to the city. Mayor Adams also stressing that, yes, he does encourage protests, but he does want them to be peaceful protests. Mike.
Thank you, Madeline. Back in the Manhattan Criminal Court building, final preparations are underway. Judge Juan Manuel Merchan not allowing cameras inside the courtroom. But we've been building to this moment since President Trump tweeted that he expected to be charged and arrested. Now over to Fox News Channel for more on this developing story.
Under Alvin Bragg to misdemeanors. And, just the irony in that, Jillian, as we watch this. And, a lot of people say, he's really had to kind of contort the law into interesting ways in order to make this appear a misdemeanor that is now a felony. And whether or not there are 34 felonies that we're going to hear about, which was reported by another outlet early today. So, politically, I think that we've got a lot of chapters to go in this thing when you look at 2024. You've got a the Mar-a-Lago case, the classified documents case, is one that people think has more meat on the bones in terms of obstruction charges that could be coming down the pipeline. But this is a man who has been, in the thick of it and had people push back on him, and he pushes back hard on them as well in many cases all throughout the course of his entire career. So it's not, even though it's unprecedented, Jillian, it is not an unusual posture for Donald Trump to be in aggressive mode.
We saw some pictures of the motorcade as it's making its way down there to 100 Center Street, currently on the FDR, on the east side of Manhattan, making its way down there. I checked Waze just before we came in. It showed that that was the fastest route to get from Trump Tower down to the courthouse. Jonathan Turley, as Martha was saying, that this indictment remains under seal. There's been a little bit of leakage around it, that there's probably at least one felony count in there. But we talked in the run-up to this about the way that in order to get around the statute of limitations and to charge a former American president for the very first time in history criminally, Alvin Bragg did some creative accounting here with the charges and bootstrapping up a misdemeanor to a felony.
That's right. I mean, technically, this misdemeanor that's been widely discussed is as dead as Dillinger. I mean, it has a 2-year statute of limitations that has passed. In order to bring this back to life, if that is the basis of the indictment, he has to convert it into a felony. And for months, the theory that's been discussed is he'll allege a federal election violation, a violation that the Department of Justice chose not to charge. So there's a host of problems with that. I mean, the question is whether he even has a crime to begin with. It's not just the problem with this dead misdemeanor. The problem is that many of us don't think there's a federal election violation here. And he's had to go through, as Martha says, contortions to try to do this. Now, the other side has said, wait to see the indictment. There's going to be some surprises, some new crimes. Well, we'll have to see. But what's interesting about this trip to the courthouse is that this isn't the white Bronco O.J. Simpson trip. You know, people are looking at these cars and seeing completely different things. Half of this country views it as a president who is being taken to answer for alleged crimes. The other half tends to view this as an indictment of the criminal law system, that this is the weaponization of our legal system. And this is only going to deepen that divide, and that is concerning for many of us.
Let's pick up a thread there. Trey, Jonathan just said that essentially this entire case is a Rorschach test for the nation, and that depending on where you sit is determining what you see transpiring, you know, on your TV screen today. I mentioned a moment ago that Republicans have said this entire criminal indictment is political persecution that's masquerading as law. Trump's critics, though, say it's not as if District Attorney Alvin Bragg handed down this indictment unilaterally. He had to get at least 12 of the 23-person grand jury to agree to press criminal charges.
Yeah, Jillian, of all the really tough things I've had to do in my life, getting a grand jury to indict someone would not be on that list. It is just not a difficult thing to do. The burden of proof is the lowest one that we have in our legal system. I do think it's a test, but I think in some ways the American people have already failed the test. If the polling is correct and people I mean, we got protesters out there saying this indictment is great or this indictment is terrible. The one thing they all have in common is no one has read it. So it would be wonderful if we could, like, maybe wait and see if there are any surprises. Or, look, I thought it was the wrong prosecutor with the wrong facts and the wrong legal basis. But I am open to being surprised if there is something else in it. The other thing that shocks me, Julian, is the number of people who say, yes, we think politics was involved, but yet we still support the indictment. That is pretty much what the criminal justice system should not be about, which is rewarding political friends or punishing political foes. So this is not just Trump on trial. I think in many ways it is how much we really believe that we're a nation of laws and not a nation of women and men.
You know, Andy McCarthy is a former federal prosecutor. You've seen your fair share of cases that have to deal with election issues. It looks like what is happening here is that Bragg is trying to take what was a potential financial crime and try to make it into a campaign finance violation by taking a welding torch and welding together state and federal law. Do you think he can make this fly?
I don't, John, and largely for the reasons that Jonathan alluded to for a few moments ago. I mean, first of all, as a matter of law, this is not a campaign finance violation. But I think even before you get to that, there is a very important statutory construction issue under New York law. In order to inflate this misdemeanor into a felony, the felony version of falsification of business records under New York law says you have to be trying to conceal another crime. Mm-hmm. I think the fair reading of what that means in the New York penal law is that they're talking about another New York crime. The idea that that opens the Pandora's box to any crime that you can imagine is unfathomable to me. It doesn't say anything in there about giving a district attorney jurisdiction to enforce a federal crime, and I wonder what the limiting principle is. Would a crime against the law of France be okay? So I think that question has to be addressed first, because if he doesn't have jurisdiction to enforce something other than a New York crime, the case is over. And then, even if you get out of the legal box, the proof problem he has is that he would have to prove that Trump knew that he was committing another crime and intentionally acted with in order to conceal that. The thought that Trump knew that this was a campaign finance violation, when in reality it wasn't, is far-fetched. But even if it was, that he would know that and appreciate it, also seems even more far-fetched to me. And then you have the problem that his motive in acting cannot have been to conceal a dubious campaign finance violation. I think the strong tendency of the proof, at least as we understand it at the moment, is that he was acting for the same reason the non-disclosure arrangement was made in the first place, which was to avoid, political and personal embarrassment. So I just think this is a mess in terms of trying to elevate this into a felony.
We're taking a live look right now at former President Trump's motorcade as they are pulling up to the courthouse. The streets were cleared in order for them to travel from Trump Tower in Midtown Manhattan down to Lower Manhattan as quickly as possible with the least amount of disruption to traffic there. Midday.
Yeah, there's no disruption to closing the FDR for 15 minutes while you're taking the former president down there. When he goes in the building, what he's going to do is make his way up to the 7th floor for processing. That would likely involve fingerprinting. The issue of a mugshot, we're told, was settled, and that Alvin Bragg had agreed that there would not be a mugshot. But we'll see, because you never know. Things can change. And then from processing, there he is. Right there, you see the back of his head as he's walking toward the courthouse. From there, he'll go up to the 15th floor, where he will await his arraignment, which should be in about 50 minutes from now. Again, we won't get a live look inside the courtroom, even though these are state charges, which would allow for cameras in the courtroom. The judge has agreed to a request from Trump's attorneys, Judge Merchan, to not allow cameras in the courtroom. Trump's attorneys, Jillian, had argued that this would create a circus-like environment.
Thank goodness we avoided that, John. We will get a look at the former president, though, in the hallways of the courthouse before he enters and when he comes out. We have heard from his team today that he wants to address the American public and the media directly during one or both of those opportunities. Obviously, if a gag order is imposed during this arraignment, which our legal analysts tell us is unlikely, but if it is imposed, probably wouldn't hear from him on the other end because he would be under the judge's orders.
And in fact, on that point, let's bring in Martha McCallum, because Martha, the one thing that this president is known for doing is lashing out at anybody who affronts him on social media and then whatever other platform he can get his hands on as well. As a presidential candidate, could this judge limit his ability to talk about this case and take away the tools that the president would use to fight back against the myriad stories that will be written about this in every publication across America and on every television screen across America, for that matter, around the world?
Well, I think it's very difficult to get the former president, Donald Trump, to not talk about something. I think that would be a very difficult bar for him to put on himself. If the judge does impose that, I think it's pretty tricky, and we can get the lawyers to weigh in. But given the fact that this is a former president who served one term and now wants to run for a second term, which I would also just point out is something I think we don't emphasize enough. This is such a highly unusual situation where you have a president who is running for a second term, having, lost in the last election and wants to go back again. And so what we're looking at right now is a president who is facing charges that have, I think it's fair to say, unlikely, but potential jail time, who either would see jail time or potentially go back to the White House. I mean, that just sums up, I think, how unprecedented this is. The gag order situation will be a very unique decision, given all of that environment, given who we're talking about here and what's fair. My guess is that if there's a gag order, the former president will find a way to talk about this right up to the edge and not actually go there. in order to allow himself the ability to talk. It reminds me of him, before he declared that he was going to run again, he would sort of talk about how inevitable it was that he was going to run again, and then say, but I'm not saying it yet because I can't do that, because that would sort of trigger a whole nother set of equations financially when you declare for presidency. But a gag order on Donald Trump is an interesting idea. I think it would be very difficult to see how that gets carried out, John.
To Martha's point, Jonathan, the president has posted on Truth Social. He writes, heading to Lower Manhattan, the courthouse, seems so surreal. Wow, they're going to arrest me. Can't believe this is happening in America. MAGA. Jonathan, what do you think the odds of a gag order being imposed during this arraignment are?
Well, the term Trump gag order seems a contradiction in terms. I mean, the idea that you could succeed in gagging the former president is to attempt something that has never been achieved before. I doubt that he would comply, but I also believe a gag order would be unconstitutional. I'm not a big fan of these gag orders. I think they raise serious free speech questions. In this case, I think that it could very well be unconstitutional. You would be gagging a presidential candidate who has been running on the weaponization of the criminal justice system for 4 years. You would be telling him he couldn't talk about one of his main talking points. Now, having said that,
Jonathan,
this is also an interesting test for Trump.
Sorry to interrupt you. Quick follow-up on that for clarification. What happens potentially if he breaks the gag order? Are there options available to the judge? What unfolds then?
There are options. The most common is you get a hefty fine per violation, but you can also be held in contempt. You could be put into custody to answer to the court as to why you disobeyed a clear and open order. You're not supposed to violate these orders. You're supposed to appeal them. I actually think an appeal could very well strike down such an order. Now, there is a test for Donald Trump here, and that is, he has many people on his side that have not been supporters. He has people who are some of his fiercest critics saying, yeah, this does look like the politicalization of the criminal justice system. The question is whether he will waste that moment. The president is comfortable in chaos. It may be his element. He tends to go on attack. But at this moment, the question is whether he will rise above it and seem more presidential, to bring reason to the rage and to say instead, this is a threat to the presidency. It's not just about me. And we have a point here to raise that regardless of how intense our disagreements may be, we have to have this common article of faith that the criminal justice system is not used for political purposes. That's the message that will resonate, I think, with many people who may not be his supporters.
Jonathan, Martha, Andy, and Trey, stand by with us for a second because we do want to come back to you. But first of all, we want to jump to Brian Yennis. He's live outside the courthouse at 100 Center Street there in Lower Manhattan with the very latest after the president's arrival. Brian, what do you got?
Hey, John. Well, look, there are I would say pro-Trump supporters who are lined up here behind our cameras of the media. They are holding onto the fence, just trying to get a view of what's happening. Obviously, the former president is inside. I do want to talk a little bit about what we could expect inside during his arraignment. We know he's being processed. This is what the schedule said. He'll be processed and be brought to the courtroom for his 2:15 p.m. arraignment. But while he's inside, I think we'll learn more about the possible motions that his defense team will want to file. That'll be probably one of the most substantive things that'll come out of today's hearing. For instance, the motion to dismiss this case outright, the motion to perhaps change the venue. It'll really give us an inside look into the playbook for his defense team, and they'll schedule that out when the next hearing will happen for each one of these motions. And I think that'll be definitely a substantive thing. I also think this is fascinating in the sense that this is the first time that the former president will be face-to-face with the judge, Juan Merchan. And Judge Merchan, I will say, this is his fourth Trump case. He oversaw the Trump Organization case in which the organization was fined $16 million. He oversaw the case that sent the former CFO, Alan Weisselberg, to prison for 5 months. And he's about to oversee the Steve Bannon case over the border wall and defrauding donors later this year. And a lot's been made about whether or not the DA Bragg had any say in the judge here. And we've been told that the DA has no say in the judge overseeing a case, that is a decision that's made by the court. And usually it's random, but if a judge has the kind of intel or has, for instance, overseen cases that are related, and in this case he obviously has, having overseen 3 of those cases I just mentioned, then that trumps those other things, for lack of a better word there. And so that is why he would perhaps see this case. So I think this is going to be fascinating in the sense that this is obviously somebody that the former president on Truth Social has called bias. He has said that hates Trump outright, and we've heard from Joe Tacopina, his attorney, that no, he's trying to pull back on that and say no, that we don't think he's biased. So it'll be very fascinating to see how this judge reacts to the former president and to the defense lawyers, and what the playbook will be from his defense. I think that'll be probably the most substantive thing we'll get in terms of the motions laid out by them.
You know, when you consider, Brian, that he was appointed by then Mayor Bloomberg to the family court in 2006, Judge Merchan's life and his caseload has certainly taken a turn for the more, I guess, greater public visibility as well as notoriety here. Wow.
Now, at this arraignment, Brian, this is Jillian. We know that in order for Trump to receive these charges today at the courthouse, what went on preceding this is that at least 12 out of the 23 grand jurors assigned to this case had to agree there was enough material evidence to press forward with this case.
Yeah, that's right. And 12 out of 23, again, is a low bar. They were able to move forward with that. So, again, I think what Trey Gowdy was saying is spot on. We will all learn very shortly what is in this indictment and what kind of evidence they perhaps have. And we'll also obviously hear from DA Bragg. And I do want to give people a sense of the process out here. Obviously, cameras aren't allowed inside the courtroom, but obviously there's people out here that are gathered, and the press and journalists who were let inside. Some journalists were given a green ticket, and they'll be inside the courtroom to document what's happening. Others were given a white ticket, and they'll be in the overflow room. And those journalists, as soon as they're able to, when this arraignment is done, will relay to the rest of us and to the world what was said. And we're going to send a producer to the court clerk and try to get a copy of that indictment. We have no indication that it's going to be handed out to the press willy-nilly, for instance, just given to anybody who shows up to court. But as soon as we get a sense of that indictment, we'll be able to go through those charges and be able to finally verify what's been reported for as long for over the last couple of weeks. And Jillian, one more point. New York law states that if you were to break a gag order and if that were to be implemented by the judge, it would be a $1,000 fine and up to 30 days in prison, or both. But that, again, obviously extremely hypothetical. We don't know what's going to happen, but I just wanted to clarify that in the sense of what kind of punishment we're talking about here in New York.
Just want to flag for our viewers what you were seeing. There was a head-on shot of the president for the first time. He gave a fist bump to the crowd after he got out of the limo before he headed inside the courthouse. Brian Yenna, stick with us. We'll come back to you shortly. Thanks.
Meantime, let's go back to Trey Gowdy for more on this. Trey, Brian mentioned that there's probably going to be a couple of motions filed. One of those would be summary dismissal of the case. We don't know if the judge would even entertain that, but that's sort of a pro forma thing that most defense attorneys do. And the other is a potential request for a change of venue. And it looks like it's something that the former president is pushing, because let me go to this post on Truth Social that he put out earlier today. He said, quote, "Very unfair venue with some areas that voted 1% Republican. This case should be moved to nearby Staten Island. Would be a very fair and secure location for the trial. Additionally, the highly partisan judge and his family are well-known Trump haters." He points out that the judge's daughter worked for Kamala Harris's campaign as well. Based on the fact that I don't know where you would find a juror who hasn't made up their mind about Donald Trump, and where you find an impartial jury in all of this, Trey, given the venue as well and the overwhelming sentiment of folks in Manhattan when it comes to Donald Trump, does he have a good case for a change of venue, even if it stays within the 5 boroughs of New York City?
John, I think you'd be surprised at some of your fellow citizens and how little they know about current events. We have gotten juries in other high-profile cases before. I know Andy McCarthy is one of our panelists. I think he was just a boy when Aaron Burr was was tried, but with John Marshall, I believe, being the chief judge of that trial, and I don't think a change of venue was granted there. So what the judge has to do is get the veneer, the jury panel in there and say, can you be fair? Even if you have an opinion on Donald Trump, can you be fair? And look, I'm not the lawyer that Turley and McCarthy are, but my advice to the president, if you are complaining about pretrial publicity, having a rally could possibly undercut that. If your argument is there's just too much pretrial publicity, then having a press conference and a rally may actually be contributing to the pretrial publicity.
Trey, let's talk about the charges that are hopefully going to be unsealed imminently. We don't know what is in them, as you rightfully pointed out. A lot of sort of finger pointing has been based on speculation to date. But we know, thanks to court leaks, direct to Fox News Channel, that there are at least 30 distinct charges. One of them is reportedly a felony. What types of charges could be included here? We know that all eyes are on the alleged hush money payments to Stormy Daniels. There's been some reporting. There could be charges related to Karen McDougal as well, other kinds of business dealings, possibly. What is the likeliest scenario to your legal mind?
Oh, gosh, I'm terrible at speculating, but my guess would be, because the way prosecutors' minds work is they think, if I don't have great facts, let me at least have a bunch of counts. So it might be 34 different instances of Michael Cohen being reimbursed for legal expenses by the former president. If it's 34 discrete fact patterns, 34 different Stormy Daniels and McDougals, then that may be a challenge. But if it's the same fact pattern and just 34 different versions of the exact same picture, I think the perception's going to be that that's an act of desperation, and that's prosecutors kind of trying to stack it to make it look like it's really important because they have a weak fact. They have weak facts.
Trumped up charges, pardon the pun.
Let's go to Andy McCarthy, Trey, because you mentioned him, and I know that you weren't a young lad when Aaron Burr was tried. You were in law school at the time, as I recall. But Trey makes the point, Andy, that an impartial jury was found for that trial. Can an impartial jury be found for Donald Trump? I think since Hamilton, the play came out, everybody knows who Aaron Burr is. So this day and age, you might have a harder time getting that impartial jury. But seriously, I think this is a big issue. I appreciate what Trey said, but I don't know anybody who doesn't know Donald Trump and hasn't formed an opinion of him one way or the other.
Well, John, I appreciate you and Trey because my sons think I was at the trial of Socrates. So if we're going to start with Aaron Burr, that gives me a little spring in my step. You know, I'm of two minds about this. In terms of the fairness of the jury, you know, in the mid-'90s, in that very area, I think our federal courthouse is probably a block and a half from where they are now. We tried a dozen terrorists who were implicated in the bombing of the World Trade Center just 8 blocks away from the courthouse. Terrorists are obviously, you know, deeply, deeply unpopular defendants. And every reviewing court that looked at that thought that they got a very fair trial. So I think if the process is fair and the court is fair, you can get a fair trial. Moving the trial to Staten Island wouldn't make much of a difference, not only because of how you point out that Trump is a high-profile public figure, but also, you know, we've had cases where when the trial gets moved, that doesn't mean you get a new judge, you know, and if the judge is the problem for the president, and I think a judge can be a much bigger problem than a jury, and he comes with the case to Staten Island, that really doesn't advance the ball for Trump. But I guess my attitude about this is I refuse to indulge the fiction that this is an episode of the criminal justice system doing justice under circumstances where this is a purely infused, pervasive political process where you have a district attorney who is only nominally a district attorney. Substantively, we would better understand Alan Bragg as an elected progressive Democrat who ran for office vowing that he would leverage the powers of his office against his partisan enemies. That's like his day job. His night job is actually dismissing the cases of criminals who were preying on New Yorkers. But he vowed that this would be a political objective of his. He's now achieved it. And I just think, you know, with all due respect for Trey's point about, you know, Trump having a rally and, you know, that taints the jury pool as much as, you know, anything else that can be done here. The thought that you could have a political prosecutor run for office on using his power to do exactly what he's done and continue himself for over a year to taint the jury pool. And now that he's filed an indictment, we're going to blow the whistle and say, okay, now due process starts and we all have to be very concerned about tainting the jury. Forget it. I mean, that's ridiculous. Right now, this is a highly partisan, highly political process. We have a progressive prosecutor who has taken a crime that he wouldn't prosecute against anyone conceivably except Donald Trump. He would never bring this misdemeanor against anyone. He's brought it against Trump. It's time barred. He's bringing it against Trump anyway. He's trying to dress it up into a felony by invoking federal law that he doesn't have any jurisdiction to prosecute. And that's how we land in court. That's not the criminal justice system. That's a political persecution.
Martha, I want to turn back to you for a moment here. Regardless of what unfolds and how and in what order today, the former president now finds himself in this unprecedented territory of needing to navigate and fight a legal battle. He's facing the prospect of criminal indictment right now while he is pursuing re-election to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. How does the campaign drive this forward? How does he ride a platform that's focused on voters while fighting this legal battle?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it really goes, I think, to the uniqueness and history of this political figure of Donald Trump. We're just getting a closer look inside, I guess, one of the side doorways here. And you know what, Jillian, I just want to reread the message that the former president sent while he was headed down there, which you mentioned earlier. And this is what he sent out on Truth Social. Donald J. Trump, heading to Lower Manhattan, the courthouse, seems so surreal. Wow. They're going to arrest me, in caps. Can't believe this is happening in America. And then MAGA with an exclamation point. I mean, you know, I think that that former President Trump is a person who looks at any given situation and says, how can I make this work? You know, how can I take what's being thrown at me in this case, and how can I make it work for me? And I think that they have done everything they can to try to put the message out there that he is being unjustly persecuted. You just heard from Andy McCarthy a strong legal argument for why that would be the case in this particular set of circumstances. And they have fundraised quite a bit on this issue, and they're even getting support from people who aren't really big supporters of President Trump. So I think that you're seeing this, and I think we may get a chance to hear something from the former president in this hallway. We did hear that there were positions there where we might be able to hear from him, so we'll jump out if that happens. But, you know, I think he's going to make the best of it, Jillian. And I think he's going to try to turn it to his advantage in every possible way. And I think you're going to see a lot of motions. I think you're going to see this dragged out as much as his attorneys possibly can, because they do believe that this charge, at least, this indictment is unmerited.
So, Jonathan Turley, let's bring you in, because a couple of points here. I've just been texting back and forth with one of former President Trump's sons, Eric. Apparently, according to Eric, his father is feeling strong today. Told me that he said he's sad for this country, but I, Eric, have never met someone with more backbone. He also makes the point, he says, Alvin Bragg has shut down the entire city, called up 38,000 NYPD police officers, closed down the FDR, and is spending $200 million of city funds for a $130,000 non-disclosure agreement. Eric Trump goes on to say, I never thought I would see this political corruption in our country. I guess, Jonathan, when prosecutors go after a target, they don't care how much it costs. They just want to try to get a kill.
Well, that's it. The problem is that this case has a thrill-kill feeling about it. When you look outside that courtroom, there are people who are truly thrilled by this prospect, but it is not a thrilling prospect for many of us. We'll have to see what is in this indictment, but what we have heard previously over weeks and months really raised serious concerns for many of us, that this is not blind justice, that there is no way that this charge would ever have been brought against anyone but Donald Trump. They're just working too hard. And that does play into the venue issue. I agree with everything that was said previously. I've brought venue change motions. They're routinely turned down. I had one case that I thought was a lead pipe cinch for a motion, and it was still turned down. Judges tend not to transfer high-profile cases. And part of it is because they believe the United States is a media-saturated environment, and you're not going to get away from that, particularly with someone like Donald Trump. But you also don't have a DA who ran on the promise to bag Trump and was elected into office by people in this district based partially on that pledge. That's something you don't often have in the mix of a venue change. And the question is whether the judge is going to want to make some type of gesture to the many people in the country who feel this is a political prosecution by at least moving this out of Manhattan. But I think that what you're going to see is that this is sort of Super Tuesday, a legal Super Tuesday for Donald Trump. This is the beginning of a new type of presidential campaign. We haven't faced this issue since a socialist named Debs ran for office while incarcerated. This president is going to be running on this issue, and the public may be voting on it. And so starting today, we're going to have a presidential election like one we've never seen before, where the criminal justice system itself may be on the ballot.
Andy, I want to ask you about what is going on behind closed doors right now. We got a shot inside the courtroom. We obviously don't have eyes on the former president, but what is happening now as we speak is that he is surrendering. He is turning himself in. When we next see him walk out those doors and walk into the arraignment, is he going to be under arrest? What do you talk about, or how do you talk about this moment we're living through right now?
Yeah, there's a common understanding, Julian, of what arrest is. You know, people think of, getting handcuffs slapped on you on the street. What it really means legally is that your capability to leave is no longer your own. In that sense, he is under arrest now because he has surrendered on the charges, and it'll be an arrest on his, his future criminal record. What typically happens in this situation is you are put through a process. We understand that this process probably won't include mugshots, photographs, but he'll be fingerprinted. That happens to everybody who comes into the system. The fingerprints will go into a criminal justice database that all of the police organizations across the country have access to. Typically, and there's nothing typical about this, but in the typical case, there would be an opportunity for the police potentially to conduct an interview, or at least the inspectors from the district attorney's office. That won't happen here because former President Trump is formally indicted, which means that he has a right to counsel at all material moments in his prosecution going forward. His lawyers are obviously not going to allow him to be interviewed. So they will wait in a secure area until an appointed time. He won't be put in a lockup like most defendants would, where they would wait for being presented in court.
Andy, can I just follow up real quick? So does that mean that from this point going forward, Donald Trump is not free of his own volition to leave that courthouse until the judge tells him that he may?
Well, this is another one of these things, Julian, where we have to say, let's hope they don't test the boundaries of that. My view of this all along is that the Secret Service is an excellent organization. The NYPD is probably the best police force in the world. The district attorney's office has good inspectors. What I assume is everybody is cooperating so that everybody gets what they need out of this. The police need to make sure he's processed. The Secret Service need to make sure he's safe. So I don't think the former president is going to try to rock the boat by saying, you know, I think I'm going to get up and leave, which would then put people to the test of what their authority is. I think he's just going to roll with what they're doing. So they'll allow the Secret Service to keep him in a secure location. The NYPD will be involved in that. And when the appointed time comes, they will bring him before a judge. I think we know who the judge is supposed to be, this Judge Merchan. At least that's what the Trump people have put out. And it should be a quick proceeding. Because it's a formal indictment, this will be an arraignment. When people are arrested on a police complaint, they call that a presentment, and you don't have to enter a plea. But here he's indicted, so that will be a formal arraignment, which means he'll enter a plea of not guilty. There isn't an issue of bail because this is a nonviolent offense. Under New York law, he'll be released on his own recognizance. And I guess the importance here is that the judge should begin to set a discovery schedule and a motion schedule. And as a number of my co-panelists here have pointed out, the motion schedule is probably the most important thing, because I think this is a case that ought to be dismissed on the papers before it ever gets to trial.
Well, I think former President Trump is expecting that he will be allowed to leave the courthouse, because he has got at 8 o'clock tonight plans for a news conference at Mar-a-Lago after he gets back to Florida. What we're looking at right now is the corridor outside the courtroom. This is on the 15th floor at 100 Center Street. The president, as we understand now, would have been on the 7th floor for processing. He'll move his way up to this floor, where he'll go in the courtroom. Again, no live cameras inside the courtroom, though. Unless things have changed, and I don't believe they have, there will be a still photographer there, and one photo of the arraignment will be allowed to be released. We also understand that the former president may come up to the camera that's taking this picture and say something prior to entering the courtroom, and unless there's a gag order imposed by Judge Merchan, will likely say something on the way out as well. Let's bring Martha McCallum back in. Martha, Trey Gowdy was making the point that Alvin Bragg ran on a platform of putting or getting a criminal conviction against former President Trump. He's not the only one, because the New York State Attorney General, Letitia James, ran on the same platform. There are several politicians in New York State who have run on a campaign to get President Trump.
Absolutely. And there was video of Letitia James that proved that. Alvin Bragg made it very clear, and I think that's why Andy McCarthy says that he sees him less as a DA and more as a sort of political figure, because he's been so open about his attitude and his motivation to get Trump. So, what we learned is that after they sort of stepped aside from some of the financial investigation that they were doing, then they brought in this Michael Colangelo, who was a former DOJ attorney, and brought him back onto the case to say, let's go back to that binder. Let's open that up again. Let's go little bit by little bit through all of this, and let's see if we can put together a case against Donald Trump. And it was, as you know, from 2015, this hush money question of, which ledger this financial line of this expenditure was put on, and whether it was put in the right place or not is really what this comes down to. And then, to sort of stretch it out and try to make it into a felony, which is, as I said, I'm thinking about the widow of a New York City police officer who spoke at his funeral. And she basically said that DA Bragg had made the city unsafe, and unsafe for everyone, and unsafe for police officers. And she basically blamed him from the podium at his funeral for making this city unsafe. And then you think about when we read the time and effort and money, and as Eric Trump talked about, shutting down the city in order to bring in this person for this charge, it just raises so many questions. And I think that there is this mentality out there that, that someone needs to get him, right? And so it really just flies in the face of Lady Justice, who's blindfolded, because as Jonathan Turley said before, it's impossible to imagine that Alvin Bragg would bring these charges, if they are, as we expect them to be, caveat, against anyone except for Donald Trump in this case, guys.
Stand by. I want to bring in Brett Baer. He's the anchor and executive editor of Special Report. He's also Fox News chief political anchor. Brett, amazingly, as this is unfolding, we're waiting to hear from the former president. The White House press briefing is underway. Karine Jean-Pierre was just asked about how President Biden is taking all of this in. She said, in part, this is not something he is focusing on. Obviously, he will catch part of the news when he has a moment, but it's not his focus. What do you make of that?
Not surprising, and that's some of the answers that the White House has provided already, trying to stay far away from this as far as commenting on it. You heard President Biden sidestep questions about it as well. But just 30,000 feet looking at this moment, it is surreal. You know, around the world, other countries have charged, indicted, and brought to trial former leaders, France, Italy, Israel, others. But we, as a country, have never done that. We have never, as a country, done what you're seeing right now. And that is what makes this historic. But as far as the charges that we are likely to see in coming minutes and within the hour or so, it's a lot of people wonder whether it rises to that moment. We'll see what's in there. But there are other things happening for the former president on other fronts that perhaps are more ominous. For example, just about an hour ago, the U.S. Appeals Court here in Washington ruled 3-0 against a Trump attorney effort to prevent key aides to President Trump from testifying to the special counsel Jack Smith and his team. That includes the former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. Among that three-judge panel was a Trump-appointed appeals court judge, Greg Katsas. So that's a loss for the Trump team, and they are moving forward with the case about interfering in the elections and also on January 6th. Those plus the documents case at Mar-a-Lago provide real problems, potentially legally, but this moment is the first thing that we're seeing historically of a former president being charged.
We've got some movement in the courthouse. A number of people came in. Of course, there are likely some other cases that are going on as well, or it's just those were other people who were involved in the process. But we do expect, Brett, at some point in the next few minutes, because the arraignment starts in just over 15 minutes, that we will see the former president walk through those doors and toward the camera. Again, we are told that the former president will likely want to make some sort of a comment to the camera there in the courthouse before he goes in for the arraignment. And then if he's allowed to by the judge, make a comment on the way out. Brett, we kind of kicked this around with Martha and Andy and Jonathan and Trey before, but let's get your thoughts on it. Do you believe, whether constitutionally or otherwise, this judge would be able to impose a gag order on not just a former president, but a current presidential candidate?
I think it's really tough to defend, just big picture and constitutionally. The legal minds will probably have more of a backing on this, but I think it would be tough politically to defend, especially since this is a district attorney who started this whole campaigning on trying to go after former President Trump. I think that the gag order, if it comes down, can be pretty quickly taken to court and challenged, in this case in particular.
Brett, we know from previous cases that criminal charges like this often have cascading effects. And as you mentioned, the president's facing at least 3 other potential criminal investigations into his conduct right now. Whichever way these charges go, and hopefully we'll be privy to all of them in the next 15 minutes or so, how might this strengthen or weaken the former president's hand in those other key cases?
I think that's a great question on the politics side of things, not on the legal side of things. I don't think any of these district attorneys or the special counsel are interacting saying, you go first, no, you go first, or I'm ready to go. That's not how it works behind the scenes, but it is the case that this went first. And it may be the thinnest gruel of them all when it comes to the legal punch that it delivers in the end. So by going first, does it paint others with this, an aura of it's all political. And the answer is yes, from the former president's point of view. He's going to use that to say this fits with the entire narrative of Russia, 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 and all of the things that they've been trying to go after me for years and years. The problem is that some of the substance, at least that as reported, and we believe from sources in some of these other cases, is a little bit more substantive and potentially more problematic legally for the former president.
You know, Brett, we're seeing some people, looks like Secret Service, coming through the door. Typically, when they arrive, it means just a number of moments before the protectee comes in the door. We do know that the president has been 8 floors below where this shot is being taken for the last while since he went into the courtroom, or into the courthouse rather, being processed. That would involve fingerprinting. We were told ahead of this that it would not include having a mugshot taken. After that processing is complete, he'll make his way up here. Looks like we still got a few minutes. Nothing's imminent here, I wouldn't think, but we are getting closer to court. And then he'll make his way up here for the actual arraignment. Let's go to Brian Yennis, who's live outside the courthouse. And Brian, we may need to put a button on you really quickly if we see the former president come through. But you're out there among a crowd of media, police, supporters, and protesters. What's the scene like?
Yeah, it's calm. There's a hushed silence, as much hushed silence as it could possibly be with this group. It's as quiet as they've been. We've seen about 200 people, I would say, bystanders, people here just to see the spectacle, as well as pro-Trump and anti-Trump people who've come out here to see what's going on. I want to give you a sense. This is outside of the courthouse right here. This is the main entrance, 100 Center Street. You can see that's the double row of New York State court officers who are sort of just protecting this, flanking this entire front entrance. We don't know which way the former president is going to walk out. It's possible he could come out through the main entrance. We don't see his vehicles here, but this is what we've seen here. This is the front entrance of 100 Center Street, which is the Manhattan Criminal Courthouse. And this is, you know, the street started getting blocked here at the courthouse, I would say, probably at this point about an hour and a half ago. And there was lots of sound coming from and people, you know, hitting horns and banging on drums at the park across, more of a festive atmosphere, I would say, than anything. And that has now turned to people just kind of holding on to the park fence and looking towards the front of the courthouse behind me just to see if they can get a glimpse of the former president if and when, you know, when he exits this courthouse. I will say, just on a point that Martha and I believe Brett were talking about, you know, it's not just, this is the only criminal matter he's facing here in New York, but he is facing an affront in 2 civil matters. The New York State Attorney General, Letitia James, is going after Trump for in a $250 million lawsuit for defrauding lenders and others. And there's also a defamation case that's set to be heard in April, as that's set to be held in April here in New York. Somebody accusing him of battery and whatnot. So this is, you know, on multiple fronts here in New York. This is the only criminal matter, but yeah, he's got some issues here. John, go back. We'll go back to you. Go ahead.
Hey, Brian, sorry, it looked like there was some imminent activity there with a number of people who are coming back and forth through that door. And we are getting very close. We're just 10 minutes away from the scheduled time of the arraignment. I just wanted to make sure that we didn't miss anything with the former president coming through. I mean, there's no question that prosecutors in the state of New York seem to definitely want to make a point of trying to bring criminal charges and a conviction against former President Trump, which again is why, Jillian, this idea of a gag order, when that's his only way really of fighting back against public officials making comments about him, about the media globally that will be covering this case. How do you take that platform away from him?
One of the primary beefs, for lack of a better word, that President Trump's supporters have with the indictment is that they feel that even without a gag order, this limits his ability to speak open and honestly on the presidential trail, on the campaign trail, about what he is facing in court. They feel that this puts an undue burden on him, as Martha spoke about a few minutes ago. It also puts a burden on him to fight a legal battle, potentially more than one legal battle, at the same time while he is pursuing office, something that former presidents have not had to deal with.
And you know, an indication that there may not be a gag order imposed to her here, or even a request for one, is that Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan District Attorney, has got a news conference scheduled for 3:15, not long after this arraignment wraps up. So, I mean, that could always change if the judge were to say, look, I don't care what you're asking for here or not asking for. I think a gag order is appropriate here. Then Bragg would obviously have to change that or temper the announcement. As we await for the president to come through those silver doors, let's go back to Andy McCarthy on this. And Andy, when we look at, as Brett Baer was pointing out, the myriad cases against the former president, if Bragg were to be successful here and get a conviction on the former president, that could really set the tone for other cases down the road. But if Bragg lost, or if this was summarily dismissed, that could be a blow to those other cases.
Yeah, John, I don't think it'll end up working that way, though, because it'll be a long time before this case goes to trial, if it goes to trial and doesn't get dismissed before that. And in the meantime, what we've heard in the last month is that they're very close to bringing charges in Fulton County. There was a development in court last week which makes me think that we may see that on or before May 1st. And then, as our reporting today has shown, the special counsel appointed by the Biden Justice Department is working diligently away at trying to make a case on the Mar-a-Lago documents and on January 6th. So that case is moving forward, too. We may have all these charges, if there are more, on the table before any of these cases is resolved. And I would just point out, you know, the fact that we mention that there are political implications here doesn't mean that every one of these prosecutors has the same political agenda or the same political motivation. You know, the Democratic prosecutors in other parts of the country may have wished that Alvin Bragg stood down because of the taint effect that this case is going to have on their cases. But he has his own constituency. Again, he ran here in Manhattan promising that he would do exactly what he's done, which is haul Donald Trump into court. And no matter how this case turns out, the people who elected him, and especially the progressive activists in New York, they're very pleased with this development. What they want is Trump dragged through this process. So regardless of how that implicates the perception of the other cases being worked on by other prosecutors across the country, I think Bragg is answering to his own political constituency.
I want to bring in Brett for a moment. Brett, Andy just mentioned the political implications here, so I want to draw your attention back to the 2024 campaign cycle. The big question there is how voters feel about what they're seeing transpire today. We talked earlier about how it's a bit of a Rorschach test. What you see depends a whole lot on where you sit politically. It's also true that 2024 is likely going to be decided by a few 100,000 swing voters in a handful of states. How do those swing voters, you feel, perceive these charges in this case against Trump?
We just saw Bragg walking.
That's a great question. That was Alvin Bragg just walking through. Sorry, go ahead, John.
No, go ahead, Brett.
Yeah, it was that was just a quick glimpse of the District Attorney Alvin Bragg sneaking out of that door to mention that. I agree with you, Jillian. That is the big question. Right now, it is a unifying effect. When you have Jeb Bush coming out in support, in principle, of Donald Trump because he thinks that these charges are politically based, when you have parts of the Republican Party who are not inclined to back Donald Trump speaking up for him, and you have a unifying effect in the base that you've seen polls go up and fundraising increase in the short term. In the short term, there's a clear shot in the arm as far as attention. The fact that it's wall-to-wall news coverage is, harkens back to the 2015-2016 time frame when the president was not president and he was getting this kind of attention on the trail. I think, as time goes on and how these other cases play out, other candidates will maybe look to talk about that, about running for office without the chaos, without everything that surrounds it. Asa Hutchinson, the former Arkansas governor, is already doing that, but he's alone in that. It's a lonely trail because right now everybody's singing from the same sheet of music, that they think this is a political prosecution on the Republican side.
Yeah, again, we're now within 3 minutes of the scheduled start time of this arraignment hearing. We saw Alvin Bragg, as Brett was pointing out, walk in. We have seen Walt Nauta, who is the president's personal aide, come through those doors. The president, the former president, usually not far behind. So we're expecting that this is going to happen in the next little while. It is, I think, worthwhile as we await the arraignment here that Alvin Bragg has been really making a career here out of downgrading felony charges. In 2023, of 1,972 cases, 54% of those felonies were downgraded to misdemeanors. The year before, 52% were downgraded. And when you take a look at the number of felony cases resulting in convictions, this year, year to date, 52% resulting in convictions, 50% last year. So it was a 50-50 case in 2022. You had a 1 in 2 shot of beating the rap, if you will, on the felony charge. Now 48% of felonies so far this year have not resulted in conviction. So that gives the president, former president, a pretty good chance at beating this.
I mean, for all intents and purposes, it seems the opposite is, according to our legal analyst, is happening with this case and these charges against the former president. They say Bragg is taking what is essentially, usually, historically treated as a misdemeanor and elevating it to a felony. Also important to point out, John, last year, former presidential candidate Hillary Clinton settled a campaign finance violation over reporting the Steele dossier funding as legal services. She paid a fine for that. She was never arrested.
Yeah, I mean, when you take a look at the cases of Hillary Clinton, when you take a look at the cases of Bill Clinton, you could make a case that a zealous prosecutor could say, you know what, I don't believe the fact that they both should have walked pretty much scot-free. I'm going to bring a criminal case against them, yet that never happened. But in this case, we have a state prosecutor who was saying, you know what, I don't like what happened. I don't care that the feds didn't want to charge him. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do this. So this is a precedent-setting case in so many different ways.
In just a few minutes, we might very well finally see those charges, all of them, which will answer some of the questions, whichever way this thing goes, whether it fuels the fire of people who say this is political persecution, or it redeems Bragg, and perhaps he has had access to information, evidence, witness testimony that those who came before him did not. We will hopefully find out in the next few minutes.
We're overhearing some radio traffic here with the NYPD officers who are on scene. We should be, I mean, we're just about 20 seconds away from the scheduled start time of this arraignment, so we should at any moment now see the former president walk through those doors. It will be interesting to see if he comes to the microphones and does have a comment on the way in. I expect, based on what he has been saying about Alvin Bragg and Judge Juan Merchan on Truth Social, that he will probably voice his opinion on what he thinks of this process and how he believes it's unfair, how he thinks that the venue is unfair, and that he is being, in his mind, unfairly persecuted for what transpired. Eric Trump again was saying, and Martha pointed this out as well, that this city has gone, or this prosecutor has gone to enormous expense for a $130,000 non-disclosure agreement. Now, again, if you're accusing someone of a crime and prosecuting them for a crime, you don't do a balance sheet for it. A prosecution is worth whatever you believe it's worth. But, you know, there are a lot of people who say this prosecution is not worth the paper that it's written on, let alone the expense that the city has incurred because of it.
Let's go ahead and bring back Jonathan Turley now. Jonathan, just a few moments until we're going to have access to those charges. We're hoping that they will be revealed in their entirety shortly after the former president goes into the courtroom. We do have a producer inside. He will be sending us information as soon as he gets out of there. He's not allowed to have a phone with him and communicate on it while he's inside there. But talk to us about reporting today confirmed to Fox News that there are more than 30 charges. One of those is a felony.
Well, one very likely has to be a felony. If they're going to use this bootstrap argument of the New York misdemeanor, they have to bring that misdemeanor back to life, and the only way to do it is to say it was committed to hide a felony. So that would be part of that theory. Look, we've all known the most obvious fact that history is being made. The question we're going to learn in the next few minutes is what type of history. Is it good or bad history? Many of us have no objection to a former president being indicted. That can be a vindication of the rule of law. It can also be the degradation of the rule of law. If you proceed against a former president for political reasons, it is the very antithesis of our legal system. So whatever comes out of that gate in a few minutes, hopefully will be more than what we have heard if the rule of law is going to be vindicated. Hopefully it'll be more than just 34 versions of this rather dubious legal theory that's been bantered about for weeks. Now, the suggestion is that there might be something new in the indictment. What we're looking for is, are there new crimes? Are all of these related to payments around 2016? Are they all based on different variations of this bootstrap argument? Alternatively, do they have some new crimes that might deal with business or tax fraud allegations? We're going to learn that soon. But really, the call of history is weighing heavily, not just on Donald Trump, but I think on Alvin Bragg. You know, it is one thing to be the first person to indict a former president. It's another thing to do it without cause or to do it with political reasons or motivations. So this can be his most famous or his most infamous moment as a prosecutor.
Yeah, again, we don't know what's in that indictment because we haven't seen it. It may be that he's got a very thin case here, that he's tried to weld the misdemeanor to a federal felony and has failed to do it, or there may, as Jonathan Turley suggested, be some other things in there which are much stronger than what has been talked about here. And as we await the president's arrival, and I'm told that these are officers of the court, not NYPD. Sorry for that. They have the same shaped badge or emblem on that the NYPD do. I'm working off a very small monitor with tired eyes as well. But let's bring in Martha McCallum here, because Martha, we expect that the president is going to walk through those doors and walk up to the camera and make a comment. Could this be the beginning of a reboot of his campaign?
It could be. I think, as Brett noted earlier in the day, when the president announced his campaign to run again in 2024, it didn't get a whole lot of hoopla. It was fairly quiet. And this has clearly created a lot of drama and a lot of attention around the former president. He has said it is not this form of attention that he wanted. He thinks this is very sad, what is happening here. You know, I would just point out or reiterate, I guess, that, you know, this is very unusual. That we don't do this here in the United States. I was just looking at information on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who, you know, came back to office with an indictment hanging over his head. That's generally not the way that we do things here in the United States. But that precedent has now been broken with this case, John. And we'll see if we hear from the former president here. He doesn't like to walk by cameras and not say something. So we'll see if he's in that mood today. But we do expect this is going to get underway very shortly, John.
Let's go ahead and bring in Harold Ford Jr. He's co-host of The Five, also a former Democratic Tennessee congressman. Harold, interestingly, Adam Kinzinger said a moment ago this. He writes, America faces great political polarization, and this indictment will not help, but upholding the rule of law is imperative to our nation's long-term success. What do you say about that?
He could be right. I, like you, am waiting to see what's in this indictment, what the facts are that support it. I think Jonathan has said, Professor Turley has said well. And again, I've urged everyone to show some restraint here. I think some of the speculation could be right. Some of it could be wrong. But we'll know here in a few minutes. I do think the great gift that we all as Americans have is that we're presumed innocent until and unless we're proven guilty. And we must all remember that former President Trump, who has been indicted, is presumed innocent until facts are presented and evidence are presented that prove otherwise. And hopefully we learn in this indictment what the at least skeletal evidentiary claims are that the district attorney has. I would also remind everyone that most district attorneys in this country are elected. So they all run on a platform. So I don't take the idea that he ran on a platform of prosecuting former President Trump as anything other than something that DAs do when they run all across the country. Having said that, he best have a case, because if the DA does not have a case here, I think you will hear Republicans and even some Democrats encourage that this case be dismissed or it be denied a trial.
You know, what you said there, Harold Ford Jr., about innocent until proven guilty is in sharp contradiction to the way that Nancy Pelosi put it when she said that the former president will have a chance in court to prove his innocence. But here's what Chuck Schumer said a short time ago. I'll try to read this without taking my eyes off the screen here. I don't want to miss the former president's entrance. Schumer said, "I believe that Donald Trump will have a fair trial that follows the facts and the law. There's no place in our justice system for any outside influence or intimidation in the legal process." Harold Ford Jr., given the president's prominence as a public figure, can that happen in America?
Of course it can. I think anyone that tries to besmirch the idea that we have one system of justice doesn't understand our judicial system. Even in our judicial system, we have checks and balances. So if something happens at a lower court that people believe, that lawyers believe, there was a violation of someone's rights, they can appeal. They can appeal all the way up to a Supreme Court at the state level or obviously at the federal level. So I'm not one who believes that anyone is above the law, nor am I one that believes that anyone should be targeted by the law. And to your question, John, I'm not a believer that no one is no one is so important, or that no one is so supersedes humanity that the legal system can't treat them fairly. If DA Bragg does not have the evidence, does not have the facts, President Trump will, if he goes to trial, will be acquitted. And if there's not evidence to support the kinds of claims that we're all speculating might be in this indictment, then a judge will likely dismiss this. But like many, I'm going to wait to see what's in the indictment before I comment much more on what may happen or what may not happen.
Let's bring back in Brett Baer for a moment here. As this is unfolding, Brett, last night we learned that Special Counsel Jack Smith, who's managing the classified documents case, discovered new evidence pointing to Trump's obstruction. Reports are that he has new witness statements, security camera footage, and some other kind of documentary evidence that speaks to the idea that Trump himself tampered with classified documents in his home in Mar-a-Lago after the archives requested that he return those documents to them.
Right, and that's the reporting after the subpoena. We also at Fox reported that Jack Smith, the special counsel, is compelling the testimony of Secret Service agents to the grand jury this week as well. Those cases are moving forward. The documents case, the January 6th case, and the election interference case overall are moving forward in different ways. And as I mentioned before, the Court of Appeals saying that former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and other senior aides need to testify to the grand jury. And there was an effort to prevent that from the Trump legal team. They lost in court. They went to appeal. They lost on appeal. And now they're going to have to move forward. It's not likely they're going to go to the Supreme Court on that one. I just want to bring this up as we wait for the former president to possibly come through those doors. The White House briefing just moments ago, there was an interesting exchange between Karine Jean-Pierre and Michael Sheriff at the New York Times. And there was a number of reporters have been asking her to comment on this indictment and what it means, big picture reaction. And she is, as you noted earlier, kind of punted, as the White House has done. But he was essentially saying, wait a second, you are saying you can't comment on the Trump indictment because it's an active case, but you and the president can discuss have no issue discussing January 6th. And there are 500 active cases in that situation. And they went back and forth, and it was kind of a heated exchange. The reporter Michael Shear saying, don't lecture me. In other words, the lack of response from the White House on this front from weighing in, and yet weighing in on something that the special counsel is specifically looking into is quite a dichotomy as we wait for the former president to address these charges after this arraignment.
I want to ask Andy McCarthy something about a topic that Brett brought up. And Andy, that is the documents and this new reporting that the president, after the subpoena was issued, may have looked through the documents. He was on Sean Hannity's show a few days ago. Apparently the president is heading up, former president is heading up to the courtroom now, I've just been told. So, Andy, why don't we delay that request for just a second. I'll just say that the former president was on Hannity's show. Hannity said, I can't see you doing that. And Donald Trump said, well, I had the right to do it. And I'm not quite clear, and that's why I wanted to ask Andy about this, whether or not he does actually have the right, after being president, to look through potential classified documents, unless he has previously declassified them. But he maintained that he had previously declassified them. So that's an argument that we could take up in a few moments. But again, I was just advised that the former president is heading up to the courtroom now. So any moment now, Jillian, we should see him come through those doors.
And if he does stop to speak to cameras and to the American public, we'll see him there. If he doesn't, just a few steps from that door into the courtroom. We will then have to wait to hear from the former president until after he is arraigned. We will hopefully hear him. He has expressed to his team as recently as this morning that he wanted to address the events of the day himself, personally and directly, John.
All right, well, here comes his legal team right now. They are on the way in, which means that he will be right behind them, I would imagine. Which one was his attorney? So let's not forget that Alvin Bragg not only is he setting precedent from bringing criminal charges for the very first time in this nation's history against a former president, but he's taking a case, and this is the hush money that was paid to Stormy Daniels back in 2016, just before the election. He's taking a case that the feds said they wouldn't prosecute. Here comes the former president. Let's just listen into this.
President Trump, will you come speak to us? President Trump?
And he went right into the courtroom. We thought that he was going to come up to that camera, but change of plans to what we had been advised. And he just walked straight in there. So again, we are told that there is a still photographer who is in the courtroom who will be allowed to publish one photograph of the president there before the judge, Juan Merchan. And we will not see anything live from inside the courtroom. It is state court, and typically cameras are allowed in state court, but the Trump legal team made a request to the court that live cameras not be allowed to cover the proceeding because it would create a circus-like environment. Let me bring Martha in on this, because Martha, you and Brad are very astute politically. You would think on the one hand that former President Trump, who loves to do literally everything in front of a camera, would want the nation to see what was going on to bolster his position that he's been unfairly persecuted. But then at the same time, if you see him say not guilty, that is an image for the ages that his opponents would likely try to exploit.
Yeah, indeed it is, John. I thought that the former president looked very somber, very serious when he walked out that door. You know, I think there's no underestimating the significance of what he has just been through. Somebody who has been the president of the United States of America was just fingerprinted and booked and processed to head into a courtroom to be arraigned. I mean, this is a moment that no doubt is having a heavy weight on him. We know from everything he has said he feels unjustly arrested in this case, and he will have his moment to speak. He's going to speak tonight at 8 o'clock from Mar-a-Lago. As Andy McCarthy made clear, he will be released on his own recognizance after this process that's underway now. And we're about to find out the indictments that are part of this case and how many of them are felonies. But I think that the weight of this moment appeared to be on the former president in a very significant way, as we just saw him walk through that hallway, John.
And Brett, we're in a bit of uncharted territory now. The next time we might conceivably hear from the former president is when he comes out of that courtroom, which should be sometime around 3 in the early part of that hour. He declined to speak right now, which we thought he may. The reality here is that if a gag order does come down during this arraignment, the president might not be able to speak at all from inside the courtroom.
Yeah, Jillian, that's a good question. I think it's something that We have not heard yet, and there's no indication yet that the judge is going to install that gag order, but we'll know shortly. I just want to go back to that image of former President Trump walking out and kind of glaring at the reporters as they said, will you come talk to us? And that moment of walking into the courtroom, you know, he is standing across from the district attorney, Alvin Bragg, who's bringing forward this indictment and these charges. And, you know, this is a surreal moment, a surreal image that we'll see from inside the courtroom in those still photographs, as John mentioned. You know, politically, we talk a lot about politics, but this is, you know, personal. And this is dealing with, and the photographers are now coming out after having what's called a spray of a photograph. We assume they got a couple of shots of the beginning of that proceeding. And, you know, it is personal for this president who hasn't faced this. He's been probably 4 or 5 decades under investigation or attack in one way or another before when he was a businessman and then when he was president. Now he faces a number of serious investigations, and as we've been talking about, we just don't know because we haven't seen the indictment, but this seems the least serious of the possible charges, but it is still in a courtroom and it does face a criminal penalty. So this is a surreal moment, and one that politically in the short term is probably beneficial for stirring up his base, but in the long term, a lot of people question how much this benefits him in the long term, unless everything can turn around and he can wipe it all clean.
So let's bring in the constitutional law expert to deal with a state court issue here. Jonathan Turley, how long do you expect that this arraignment will last? I've seen them be very short. I've seen them take, 20 minutes or more.
Yeah, this should be very short. The question is, if we're going to read all 34 counts has been reported, that can take time, but you can also waive that, and it can be extremely short. So he could come out at any time. What happens then is going to get pretty intense. We can expect motions from the defense for a change of venue, maybe a change of judge, maybe a challenge to Bragg himself as being part of the prosecution. But the most important motion will be the motion to dismiss. We are going to look at what these counts say. If they are based on the long debated bootstrap theory of taking a misdemeanor and essentially charging a federal election offense, then this is ripe for challenge. And if it's based on that, I believe it should be dismissed. So that's really the question that is so intriguing. You have people like Lanny Davis, who represents Michael Cohen, saying that he believes that there are other crimes here and a lot of new evidence people don't know of. We also have a leak that occurred, which is a very serious matter, saying that these are 34 counts, including at least one felony. But we really, the key here, and the devil as always, is in the details. What are those counts? Are they all 2016 payments dealing with McDougal and Daniels? Or did they find other business or tax-related issues that they can charge? That's going to be the test of history for both Trump and Bragg as we look at the weight of this prosecution. Now, he obviously has 3 torpedoes in the water. One hit, which is this Manhattan charge. He also has Georgia coming out of Fulton County. I have some question about that case, if it's based entirely on a conversation he had to, quote, find additional votes. If it's based entirely on that, I find it somewhat dubious, but that's a fact question. And so those questions tend to go to trial. It may be difficult to dismiss that case, as opposed to this one that has these threshold legal questions that can be challenged up front. But then finally, you've got that third torpedo, the one that I think is the most serious, and that's coming out of Mar-a-Lago. I don't see a really strong case yet coming out of January 6th. But Mar-a-Lago, the FBI has said from the earliest filings that they believe they have evidence of obstruction, that there was an effort to obstruct their effort to collect these classified documents. That is a very well-trod area of law for the Department of Justice. I think that's the one that represents the most serious threat.
Let's circle back to politics once again, Brett. The former president, is in the middle of a primary campaign right now. Do you think that registered Republicans are going to be focused on the treatment of Trump or the perceived mistreatment of Trump in a few months when they head to the polls? Or is this going to be a distant memory?
You know, this may stretch out for some time. I don't think it's going to, and Jonathan and Andy and others will tell you some of these cases may take a while. Others will fast track, but we're looking at probably a first debate in August of this year. You know, you're looking at the polls now where the president's up 30 points in most polls over his nearest challenger, which is someone who's not yet in the race, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Others are, you know, well below that. So there's not a sense that, you know, he's seen any detriment from these moments and these charges. And we'll see, you know, what happens after, what goes forward with January 6th and the Trump documents case in Mar-a-Lago and the election interference case in Georgia. But I will say that it will be an issue if it's still a big part of what he has to deal with once you get into the heart of the campaign. He will say it's all political, and he will likely get some support, a lot of support for that. But there will be other people who run against him saying the country needs to turn the page, and we'll see how powerful that is at that point.
All right. And let me circle back now that the former president has gone into the courtroom with Andy McCarthy on this issue of the documents and whether the former president had the legal right to look through documents after the subpoena had been issued, or look through documents that had classified markings on them, regardless of whether a subpoena had been issued. He said to Sean Hannity, I have the right to look. Does he?
The problem, John, is that his right to look at them or not look at them is really not what the material issue is there. The problem he has is that the grand jury issued a subpoena, or the Justice Department did on behalf of the grand jury, demanding that they surrender all of the documents that had classified markings that were in former President Trump's possession in Mar-a-Lago. In early June, 2 of his lawyers met with a Justice Department official and 3 FBI agents, gave them a package of about 38 documents with classified markings and a sworn statement that said they had done a diligent search and that there were no other documents left at Mar-a-Lago. So the issue is, if he was looking through boxes and looking through documents after that, it's not a question of whether he had a right to look at them or not because they were classified. It's a question of whether they intentionally misled the grand jury when they told them they had looked through Mar-a-Lago and that they were presenting to the government all of the documents that were present at Mar-a-Lago that had classified markings.
Right, so I guess the issue then is that if he was able to look through documents after they had surrendered the documents and said they had given up all the documents, that would be a clear indication in my layman's mind that there were still documents that had yet to be turned over.
Precisely. That's exactly what the issue is.
Andy, would it matter if those documents were considered totally declassified at the time he, quote, looked at them, as he claims, or does that not matter either?
Yeah, Jillian, that's a much misunderstood part of all this. The Espionage Act does not refer to classified documents. It refers to national defense information. So whether something has classified markings on it or not, and whether it was in fact classified, is evidence that it is national defense information, but it's not dispositive. So this whole business about whether he declassified them or not, there's not any evidence that's known at the moment that he did declassify them. But in terms of the Espionage Act, they just need to be national defense information, whether they have classified markings or not.
So what we're seeing on the screen right now, Andy, just want to bring your attention to it, is the photograph that was allowed in the courtroom. There you see the president in the middle with his defense team. On the far left is Todd Blanche, who is the newest member of his legal team, who was announced yesterday. He gave up his job at a very prestigious Manhattan law firm in order to take on the defense of the former president. He described it as, quote, an opportunity. I should not pass up. He said, obviously doing this as a partner at Cadwalader, which is his law firm, was not an option. So I had to make the difficult choice to leave the firm. So Todd Blanche there on the left, who also defended Paul Manafort, has made a big decision, big career decision, to leave his very prestigious law firm, at least temporarily, to defend the former president. Susan Nichelis is there beside him, in between him and the former president, and then Joe Tacopina on the right-hand side. So there is our one and only photograph from the courtroom. And Brett, let's go to you. What kind of impact does that have on this presidential candidate, seeing that photograph? Looks pretty benign to me.
Yeah, pretty benign. I think, you can make a lot out of the moment, and it just being a moment of a former president, the first time in a courtroom facing an indictment. It is not a mugshot. I think there was some thought that a mugshot could be used two ways, by his supporters and on T-shirts and mugs and everything else to back up this president. I think that's what, his supporters look at this as a political prosecution, and one in which really rallies a lot of people about two systems of justice. That's what they talk about. The people who are backing District Attorney Bragg say, no one's above the law, and they're moving forward with these charges, and he will face his day in court, and he's innocent until proven guilty. I think there are, on both sides of the political spectrum, people who go over the edge. This is a moment, and we're likely going to see, as Andy mentioned, a fast movement to try to dismiss this case based on the technicalities of trying to, as we assume, bootstrap these charges to a federal election crime.
Martha, so many moving parts today, but I think certainly when we look back on the events that have transpired, a few distinct moments in time will crystallize. Certainly this photograph of the president, the only one we're going to get from inside the courtroom, flanked by his legal team, will be something that sticks with all of us. Read the tea leaves for us. Read this moment and the impact that this photo will have.
Well, Jillian, there was some indication that last week, when all of us thought that this wasn't going to come to fruition or might actually kind of dissipate until after the Easter break, was very starkly turned around on a dime very quickly when we learned at 5:20 the other day that this indictment was indeed coming down. So that set in motion a lot of things. And it also set in motion the man that you see on the left-hand side of that picture with President Trump, Todd Blanche, who, as it was mentioned, was brought in when it suddenly became an extremely serious legal situation that was not going to be pushed aside, at least not until we hear these motions and we see what happens there. But Todd Blanche, what he was successful at with Paul Manafort and with Igor Fruman in those cases was essentially pushing the questions of the legal basis for them, right? So both of these men ended up doing time, but he was successful, Todd Blanche, in mitigating those circumstances to a great deal, and basically on legal arguments. And that, I think, is where you're going to see him pushing here when we get to these motions, which can be drawn out. But, the question of whether or not this should be dismissed, I would expect is going to be a very forceful argument that he's going to make here as you look at this team, because he is now clearly in the #1 spot now that this is an extraordinarily serious situation. But in terms of, real quick, Jillian, how this all fares as you go to 2024, we're going to have a lot between now and then that is going to transpire. So this is really just chapter 1 here in this story that will be quite fascinating to watch over the next several months.
Andy McCarthy, on this idea of a motion to dismiss, any defense attorney worth their salt always introduces a motion to dismiss at a hearing like this. I expect that that's not something that the judge would grant. And then back to something that we talked about a while ago, but some folks may have tuned in since. What about this idea of a change of venue? Because the former president is arguing that this is not a fair venue to him, that the judge has bias against him, that the prosecutor has bias against him, and that the entire borough of Manhattan has bias against him. What do you say?
Well, I think what will happen today, John, is that there'll be nothing more than a scheduling done for all of these kinds of pretrial relief, pretrial motions that will be made. I don't have a lot of confidence that they'll get a venue change here, and I don't have a lot of confidence that it would make much of a difference. I think if the Trump defense is going to succeed here, there won't ever be a jury trial. But if there is a change of venue, the change of venue would probably come with the same prosecutor and the same judge moving venue. So yes, you'd get a different jury, but judges and prosecutors tend to have a big impact on how a case goes. So I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for that to be granted. I think the best argument that the former president has going for him here is that these
Andy, it's Jillian. I'm sorry to interrupt you. We just got word into the newsroom, thanks to our producers on the scene, that the former president has officially pleaded not guilty to New York criminal charges in this court hearing that just happened a moment ago. Official plea from the former president of not guilty. What's your response?
Well, he's been indicted, so this is an arraignment, and it's a formal requirement that a plea be entered, so it's not surprising that he has pled not guilty.
All right, but it's another moment in a series of historic moments here. Jonathan Turley, again, we take a look at this and we think, oh, it's Donald Trump and he's before a court. A lot of people figured that at some point in his life this was going to happen. But he's a former president of the United States. And other than Ulysses S. Grant being arrested for driving his horse and buggy too quickly, and the charges were later dropped, this has never happened in the entire storied history of the United States of America, Jonathan.
Yeah, and let me go on record. Grant was guilty. That was charged, and in that case, his guilt was well established. Here, it might be a bit more challenging. You know, when you go back to that picture, it is notable that Blanche, sitting closest to the camera, was just added to the case, but in order to be added, he had to leave his law firm. And it's a very sad moment. If he left his law firm, because the firm did not want to have a partner representing a former president of the United States. We have seen a great backlash against firms that have represented Republicans or represented Donald Trump. And that itself really slaps at the underlying principles of our legal system. You know, he should not have to resign from a firm to represent a former president of the United States. But that's the age of rage that we live in. So the president has now pleaded not guilty, and the court is going to have to decide if this case should go forward at all. That will be the first threshold legal question. The second question will be, where should the case go forward if the first motion is denied? Now, as Andy said, I expect that motion for a venue change will be denied. I think this is a stronger case than most. Even though you end up with just the same judge and prosecutor potentially, you do end up with a different jury pool. And for me, the problem here is not just the prosecutor running on bagging Donald Trump. It's the fact that he was elected by voters in this district in part for that reason. And that creates this very troubling appearance for many people in the country. So the question is, does the judge want to try to make some type of gesture that this is not a canned hunt, that, you know, we're not just allowing a prosecutor to bring in someone that he promised that he would charge for some unknown crime.
Hey, Jonathan,
so we'll see that unfold in the days to come.
Jonathan, hold that thought for a second. Brett Baer has got some information about the charges and the indictment, which was just unsealed. Brett?
Well, just coming out from inside the courtroom, it's 34 counts of falsifying business records. And it says first degree. Now, I'm not getting the specifics of how this breaks down or if they're reading each one by one, but it is the number is 34 counts. And we could talk to falsifying business records in first degree. And as far as what cases, whether it's just Stormy Daniels or expands to the other case we were talking about, Karen McDougal and the National Enquirer, we don't have that detail yet. But we can talk about that maybe with Jonathan Turley and Andy about the falsifying business records, and that it doesn't appear that there is any other avenue that the district attorney has gone down here.
Andy, what do you make of that, what Brett just laid out? What can we read into the fact that there are 34 counts of falsifying these records in the first degree?
Well, obviously, if it's in the first degree, then we're in this posture where I presume, without having read this, that they're saying that there's another crime that he's committed that he was trying to conceal, which is what makes it a felony. It was always the fact that he's using the grand jury indicated that he was pursuing felony charges. I presume he could have filed a criminal information without the grand jury. Bragg could have by himself, had there not been felony charges. Difficult to make a judgment without having read it, but I would just say if it's based on what we already knew, I think, Trey Gowdy talked before about count stacking, which is the kind of thing the Justice Department actually has guidance telling federal prosecutors not to take a case where you have thin evidence and try to camouflage with quantity of charges what you lack in quality of evidence. And what I fear here is that they've taken what's essentially one transaction and figured out ways to compartmentalize pieces of it. So, for example, if you have one payment to Michael Cohen where he put in an invoice, they gave him a check, and then they made a business record entry, you could turn that into 3 counts, even though it's one transaction. And the whole thing is only one transaction because it's repayment for a debt. So I fear that what's happened here is that they have done exactly what the Justice Department warns abusive prosecutors not to do, which is take something that is a single unitary transaction and turn it into multiple transactions in order to create the impression that the defendant is a serious offender.
Let me just read the statute here in terms of the charges against the former president. According to New York state law, section 175.10, a person is guilty of falsifying business records in the first degree when he commits the crime of falsifying business records in the second degree, and when his intent to defraud includes, as you were mentioning, Andy, an intent to commit another crime or to aid or conceal the commission thereof. So, Jonathan Turley, I take it that the inference here is that the financial crime was done in such a way to conceal a crime of an illegal campaign contribution. Is that where we're going here?
Well, that is the assumption. That's been the second crime that's been discussed for weeks. That was the bootstrap theory that we've been talking about. So this does appear to confirm that there's not a new crime in the sense of a non-falsifying business records crime. The question is there any variation on what that felony might have been in terms of the motivation of committing the first offense? If all of these counts refer to payments that were made in 2016, then we will know. Those are related to Daniels and McDougal. If that's the case, then this would be a terrible moment for the rule of law. This would mean that all Bragg did was replicate the same flawed theory 34 times. And that doesn't improve upon repetition, if that is his theory. The reason is that the Department of Justice never brought the charge of an election violation. Many of us don't believe this is an election violation, that you could count this as a political contribution. Even people at the FEC rejected that argument. But also the Department of Justice went down this road before. It tried a Democratic presidential candidate, John Edwards, on what I thought was a stronger case that also involved hush money going to a woman. In that case, they had a child. The jury rejected those claims. And so there's a good reason why the Department of Justice may not have proceeded. But still, if the second crime here, the thing that makes it a felony in the first degree, is a federal election charge, we have a very significant threshold question that will face the court. That has never been done to our knowledge, in any case in history. It not only speaks to selective prosecution, it suggests exclusive prosecution to just Donald Trump. And so the
quick
court will
follow-up
have
on that,
a very
Jonathan.
significant issue.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We're coming up against the end of the hour. I want to make sure I get some clarity from you on this. When you talk about this has never happened in history, we know that former political candidates, presidential candidates, including Hillary Clinton, have paid financial penalties for campaign finance violations. Is embedded within these charges, again, we have not seen them yet, but we are getting early reports about them. Can we now assume safely that Bragg is making, and the grand jury is making the case in these charges, that Trump did have the intent to defraud American voters? That is definitively what they are charging him with here? Is that what differentiates this?
Yeah. I don't think we can make that assumption until we read the indictment and see what it was that he was allegedly trying to conceal. What was that other crime? We've only heard of one in all of these leaks and discussions, and that's the federal election violation. That would be really problematic.
But can we assume that that is the case that Bragg and the grand jurors are trying to make? We know that now, right?
Well, all we know is that the initial description of the indictment would fit that profile, but we don't have confirmation of what that second crime is. The concern about the grand jury, by the way, is that they only hear from the prosecution. It's not clear that they really were given all of these facts. The fact that many attorneys believe that that bootstrap argument is invalid, that's not something that the grand jury usually considers. But certainly this initial account would be consistent with reports that Bragg was going to bootstrap that New York misdemeanor, New York violation into a felony in the first degree by alleging an effort to conceal a federal election violation. But we need to still confirm that. It's consistent, but it's not conclusive.
Again, the proceedings underway here. They probably will be wrapping up soon. We may hear from the president on his way out. We were told that he wanted to talk going in and coming out. He didn't talk on the way in, so it could be that he talks on the way out. We're going to be handing over to Martha McCallum in just a little more than a minute. Andy McCarthy, give me 30 seconds, wrap up on your thoughts so far.
Yeah, I'd just like to respond to one thing Jillian just raised. Even if they regarded this as a campaign violation, even if the campaign did, even if everybody agreed that it was, which it wasn't, the non-disclosure agreement was days before the 2016 election. They would not have had to report this until well into 2017. So the idea that he defrauded the American people into electing him just doesn't hold up tenably in terms of what the timeline was.
Interesting. Brett, before we're out of time here, I want to make sure that we get your final thoughts on what we're seeing.
Yeah, I think we'll finally have all the details very shortly, but you're looking at counts that include this falsifying business records and a conspiracy count. It looks like it covers Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal and this federal election law. I think we're going to get all the details very shortly, but you see the former president there pleading not guilty, and he'll definitely have something to say shortly.
Yeah, there may also be some breaking news from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals regarding an order for Stormy Daniels to repay attorney fees to the former president. So we'll see how that goes. All right. Well, thank you for being with us on this historic occasion. I'm John Roberts.
I'm Jillian Turner. The story with Martha McCallum begins right now.
All right. Thank you very much, John and Jillian. Continuing breaking coverage here this afternoon. I'm Martha McCallum. Good to have you with us on this day as we watch the former president, Donald Trump. This is a still image on the right-hand side of your screen, flanked by his attorneys inside the courtroom. He has pled not guilty to 34 felony counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. We are told that he would like to have a moment to speak to the media and that could happen at any time after this arraignment wraps inside that Manhattan courtroom. And as I said, that image that you see on the right-hand side of your screen with Todd Blanche, Susan Nichelis, and Joe Tacopina surrounding the president as he sits at the defendant's table in the courtroom just moments ago. So obviously, as we have said quite a bit today, but it's worth repeating, this is a historic moment. We have never seen this before in the United States of America. A former president under indictment, under arrest, and now being charged with 34 counts of felonies. Former Attorney General Bill Barr is standing by with us. Britt Hume is also here to weigh in momentarily. First, we go to national correspondent Brian Yennis, who is live at the courthouse, where we expect shortly the president will be exiting soon. Hi, Brian.
Hi, Martha. Well, that's exactly right. There are two big questions right now ahead of us. One, when will the former president come out? It should be at any moment. And will he say anything to the cameras? He did not say anything walking into court. What will he say now that he knows the charges? The second question is, knowing more about this indictment. We know the indictment was unsealed, but at this point, it's about the press, all of us in the world, getting a hold of it. We have many members of the press who are inside of that courtroom, but they were barred from having their phones and their laptops on. So that is why there is somewhat of a delay for us to understand the full extent of this indictment and the charges. So as soon as we have our producer, Jake Gibson, who is inside that courtroom, as soon as he gets out, we'll speak to him and he'll tell us more about what he saw inside. But at the moment, we can only go off of the photo and off of what has been reported by Reuters, which is saying that the former president has been charged with 34 felony counts for falsifying business records. This is in violation of Section 175.10 in the New York State Code. It's falsifying business records is a felony in the first degree when someone commits the crime of falsifying business records in the second degree with the intent to defraud, and it also includes an intent to commit another crime. And this, on its surface, is not a surprise to all of us who have been following this, in the sense this is what we had expected. These types of charges, at this point, it's about the underlying details. Is this about the former adult film star Stormy Daniels? Is this about the former Playboy model Karen McDougal? We'll find that out shortly, but as of now, 34 felony accounts in the first degree, and when he comes out, we shall hopefully, we'll hear from the former president. He'll walk out of the courthouse. We expected that to be about now, but they did start a little delayed, and at that moment, we will then hear from the Manhattan District Attorney, Alvin Bragg, who has a press conference in your hour, Martha, and we'll be hearing more about what he has to say about the charges. Martha?
Thank you very much. Obviously, we're all going to be watching that with great interest here together. Let's start with bringing in Fox News chief political analyst Britt Hume. Britt, your thoughts as we watch all of this playing out in this New York courtroom this afternoon, sir?
Well, Martha, put yourself in the position of an American citizen watching this, someone not dedicated to Trump nor a Trump hater, worried about the world, worried about Russia and China becoming more united, worried about the stalemate in Ukraine, worried about inflation and the possibility of recession in this country, worried about the lawlessness at the border and the lawlessness on our streets. And he looks at this and he says, well, we're going to have an election in a couple of years. Who are we going to get? Well, Joe Biden is apparently going to run again. He's the person under whose watch these circumstances I just described arose. He's also going to be, 82 years old when Election Day rolls around. Many people think he's too old, that he's senescent, if not utterly senile. And on the other hand, the prospect seems to be clear now that we'll have Donald Trump again, a man who today stands indicted and arraigned in a court in New York City on charges that many legal experts think are flimsy and should be thrown out. It is not a moment that I think most people will find inspiring.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. And the list that you just gave us of all of the concerns going on in the world, I think about it in terms of here in Manhattan as well, Britt. When you look at an increase in serious crime of 22%, and we have a district attorney who has focused a lot of his attention on moving things from felony to misdemeanor. And in this case, he's going from misdemeanor to felony. He's made it quite clear that he wanted to get this former president, Britt. How do you think that all sits with the American people as they watch this?
Well, I must say I was struck by I guess it was a CNN poll in the last couple of days, in which a distinct minority, 37%, thought there was that a crime was involved here, but 60% were in support of the indictment, which means that an awful lot of people who don't think he did anything were happy to see him pursued anyway. That's a little disturbing, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would. I would. And we've seen those numbers. And when you have a majority of people who say they think that the motivation is political, but they'd like to see the person indicted anyway, I think it puts a fine point, Britt, on what we've seen happen in this country, just very intense division across this country over the last 6 years or so. And, I just wonder if it's responsible to take this action that we're seeing happen in New York. And we know we're going to go down this road several more times in Georgia and in this special counsel's investigation as well.
Yeah, and you have to wonder whether not just this case, but any of the cases being contemplated really rise to the level that would mean that they're necessary to bring. In light of the fact that he is a former president with an ardent following of some significant segment of the Republican base, and the feeling of alienation and disgust and distaste that those people will feel. Now, look, these people working on a case like this exist, like the Attorney General of the United States exists, at the intersection of law and politics. And you're supposed to keep the two separate, but they, in some cases, are inextricably intertwined. And that is the case here with Donald Trump. So what we would hope for in a situation like this is kind of the utmost in prosecutorial discretion. In other words, I could bring a case, but maybe it would be wiser not to. One wonders about the wisdom of this case, and certainly one wonders even also about the wisdom of some of these other cases that may be brought.
Yeah, it's a great point. And my mind goes back to James Comey standing in front of the cameras with a long list of, I think he used the word reckless behavior on the part of Hillary Clinton back then, and then said, but no prosecutor would bring these charges. And I think, it does feel like there are not, we've talked a lot about adults in the room and looking at the big picture of the country and what's best for the country overall. It feels like that's a layer that we don't really operate in a whole lot anymore, Britt.
No, I agree with that, and I think this would be a moment where statesmanship would be called for. It seems, alas, to be somewhat in short supply.
Indeed, it does. Do we have the soundbite, you guys, from that press conference? Or we're not going to cut away to that because we may be watching him walk out. We'll get to that later. Britt, thank you. Stand by for us if you would. I want to bring in Bill Barr, the former Attorney General, twice Attorney General in the Bush administration and the Trump administration, as we watch this play out. I know you've been watching it closely this afternoon as well. Bill, your thoughts. Welcome. Good to have you here. And your thoughts on this.
Well, my thoughts are pretty much the same as they've been for the last week or so. I haven't heard anything that suggests there's something new in this indictment that wasn't anticipated. If there is, then we'll have to respond to that when we see it. But I think what Brett said is absolutely right. Prosecution should always involve a measure of discretionary judgment where you weigh the public interest as a whole. And even before I became Attorney General the second time, I said in relation to Mueller's investigation that before we go off on a president, a sitting president, or a former president, there should be clear evidence of a real crime. It shouldn't be a debatable crime. The evidence should be strong. And also, this is not just by virtue of his prior office, but he's a candidate in the current election. So this is a charging decision that affects our current national politics. And judgment there, it seems to me, and prosecutorial discretion should commend caution in this circumstance. And as I've said, this appears to be just a pathetically weak case that is, I think, demonstrably wrong on the law, which explains why the Department of Justice, even after I left office, has never pursued this idea of campaign finance problem.
It was passed on by the Southern District of New York, passed on by the Federal Election Commission, this case. So, you talk about prosecutorial discretion. It looks like the next level, the next opportunity for that discretion is going to fall on this judge, Marchand, when he looks at whether or not to dismiss this case, if he feels that it is, in your words, pathetically weak. What goes into that part of this process, Bill?
Well, I think it'll be largely a legal judgment as to whether the there's really probable cause to believe that this falsification of records was done to defraud anybody. And second, whether or not this involves the campaign finance law, which I don't think it does. And I think any idea that this defrauds the voters, as Andy just said a moment ago, is simply wrong. You know, that doesn't create a crime.
But so if that's the case, and you're Judge Marchand, who has successfully prosecuted another financial case with the Trump organization, and you look at this, you know, how do you weigh that? Do you expect that because he's in this courtroom, he's just going to say, you know, no, we're not going to dismiss this charge that's been brought by DA Bragg?
No, I hope he exercises his role as a judge and serves as a screening mechanism for this kind of overreach by a prosecutor. I'm not optimistic he will, but we'll see.
So the other issues that we expect to be brought up here are change of venue. Jonathan Turley said, although that is usually something that is not acted upon, he said there might be an argument for that here. What do you think?
Yeah, I thought that was one of the stronger arguments. I agree with Jonathan on that. But again, I'm not holding my breath that there's going to be any change in that.
We also have talked about the larger scope of some of these other processes that are underway. And the one that you have said looks the most problematic for the former president is the Mar-a-Lago classified document case that's under Jack Smith, the special counsel right now. Talk to us a little bit about your thinking on that one.
Well, I think the issue there isn't the taking of the documents. I think the issue there is what happened after the department asked for them back, which they are government property, and also then subpoenaed them. And from the government's actions, I believe that they probably have evidence of efforts to mislead the government, and they're trying to determine whether Trump was behind that and was involved in obstructing their efforts to obtain the documents. And that would be viewed as a fairly serious problem. But again, discretion would come into play there as well. And I think Trump did not hurt himself initially by his bombastic statements about and his truculence about the documents and making some what were perceived as threats about public, uproar if the government was to pursue him. But on the other hand, since that, you've had Biden and Pence involved with document problems. So that would cut in favor of exercising discretion, because otherwise you would have the appearance of two systems of justice and two different standards.
But it sounds like you're suggesting that the difference is the issue of obstruction, not of having documents in your possession.
Right.
So if there was manipulation in the form of this letter that went back to the archives saying everything, we gave you everything, you've got it all. And then if they can track something that came post that shows that there were things that were moved and clearly that they understood they had possession of, that's the issue here. That's the obstruction, that at least as far as we can tell, right?
That's right. And the argument for pursuing it within the Department of Justice would be the argument, look, how can we protect all our national secrets and require that our employees and people involved in sensitive programs protect the information if we turn a blind eye to something like this? So I'm sure there's going to be some pressure to pursue that case if they have strong evidence.
So one of the things that has come up here is whether or not this judge would put a gag order in place. And we thought that the president might speak on his way into the courtroom. They were running late. He looked quite serious, as you would expect in this situation as he walked in. Do you think he will take advantage, as we've been told, of the opportunity to say something on the way out? And would you advise it?
Yeah, I think he'll take the opportunity, and I think it's fine if he does. I mean, I think it's important for him to get his message out, and I think it would be very bad to impose a gag order on him, especially in the circumstances of this case where he's a candidate in an election.
Yeah. Britt, I want to bring you back in here. Let's take a look at this exchange, Britt, and we'll cut right away from this if the former president walks out. But this is the exchange that happened in the briefing room a short time ago with New York Times reporter Michael Scher and Karine Jean-Pierre. Watch this for us.
We're just going to be very mindful. These are ongoing cases.
100 cases involving Americans whose freedom was at risk.
I hear you. But
right?
this is something that all of Americans watch in real time. In real time. And people died. People died.
I don't need a lecture on the fact that
but you're lecturing
died.
me.
But
you're lecturing me.
Yes, you are. I'm asking questions. You called January 6th historic. It was absolutely historic, and none of us had ever seen that before. Nobody's seen this before either.
So this started, I should have set it up better, Britt, but it started with a question about, what their reaction was to what's happening today in the courthouse in New York. And he's making the suggestion that, you talked about January 6th in those cases all the time. Why can you not talk about this, Britt?
Well, the sad truth is that she's not the greatest spokesperson that ever lived. And she seemed unprepared for the question. I mean, I think the general policy in the White House is, as you heard President Trump say in the driveway the other day when asked a question about, whether the case against Trump was politically motivated, he said, I have no comment on Trump. That seems to be the order of the day, and that's what his spokesperson there, the White House press secretary, was following that course. But the point is entirely correct. When it suits them politically, they'll say whatever they want to say. And this isn't the first time we've ever seen this out of a White House, but that's what's going on. Yeah,
and politically, Britt, it would seem that they are quite happy to sort of sit back and let all of this play out as the president deliberates over whether or not he's going to run again. He's probably quite happy to have the focus on this.
Yeah, and it works kind of on two levels, Martha. On the one level, the people who really dislike Donald Trump, no matter what doubts they might have or should have about the legitimacy of this indictment, the people who really hate Trump love to see the idea of him, in the dock, the humiliation of being booked and fingerprinted and arraigned and all that, even as embarrassing as that undoubtedly is for him, they love it. And they don't really seem to care whether it's a legitimate case or not. On the other hand, to the extent that it revs up his supporters and strengthens his support, at least for the moment, as the polls are suggesting, that betters his chance of the Republican nomination. And they like that, too, because they think that if Joe Biden runs, or even if he doesn't, that Donald Trump can't win again. And there's a pretty good case to be made that that may be true. And so there you go, Martha. Political calculus seems fairly simple.
Yeah. Interesting. We're getting some messages from people in the Trump circle. Eric Trump saying, this just happened. The Ninth Circuit just awarded Trump $121,000 in attorney fees from Stormy Daniels. Order just released. This is in addition, he says, to the $500,000 that she already owes him. Obviously, interesting timing on that one, Brett.
Yeah, but it's not exactly it's not the stuff of a political slogan. Vote for me. I collected $121,000 from a porn star I had an encounter with. Oh, good.
Bill, your thoughts on that judgment?
I mean, that was expected. I mean, he's entitled to those fees. The timing, I have to say, is very curious.
And it does raise this issue of, sort of the underlying issues that we're talking about here, But
I'm afraid, this is just the beginning of 2 years where, we're going to have a lot of heavy breathing about a lot of legal developments. And it's unfortunate because it'll divert attention from the serious issues that the country face and we have to wrestle with in this election.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point, Brett. And, if you're Ron DeSantis right now or Nikki Haley or anyone else who's thinking about getting into this race, how do you manage this part of the equation as a candidate?
Well, I think you'll wait for it to pass, really. I mean, look, this event has happened. The arraignment has occurred. There will be motions and news made in the course of the proceedings that might lead up to a trial, if indeed there is one. But during the rest of the time, things will return somewhat to normal. And once this day and this circus outside the Trump Tower and outside the courthouse passes, we'll be back to a normal circumstance for normal campaigning. Now, the key fact here is that at some point, one of these candidates or someone acting on their behalf is going to have to take the former president on, and to do so effectively. You've seen it done. I mean, Chris Christie did a good job on Marco Rubio a few years ago, which ended up benefiting Trump. Chris Christie, this time around, seems interested in getting in the middle of all this and taking on Trump. Well, we'll see if he does. But all these are things that are apart from today's events that will unfold or not over time. Remember, we're still very early in this process. An awful lot can happen, and early front runners often go by the board, as we've seen in a number of elections past.
Absolutely. The caveat, though, is that we're dealing with a former president who wants a second term with an interim term that came in the middle. So in many ways, he has an incumbency. But he doesn't. And it makes this just a fascinating process to watch. Gentlemen, if you could stay with us for just a minute, we're going to go to Peter Doocy, who is inside the briefing room and watched that tense exchange that we just played. Let's check in with him now. He's out on the North Lawn. Hi, Peter.
Martha, we are all out of chances to potentially hear from President Biden about what's happening in Manhattan because the White House called a lid at 3:12 p.m. That means no more events with the president where somebody could shout a question. A few minutes ago, he was meeting with his science and technology advisors about artificial intelligence. There was some shouting at the end. He did not answer anything about this or about the detained Wall Street Journal reporter, which is what reporters were asking about. There has been some chatter in town in the last couple days about the process and about the precedent that this indictment of a former president by a local DA could set. And so that is something that we asked the press secretary about a few minutes ago. Listen here.
Is he concerned at all that a local DA indicting a former president could down the line open up the possibility, set the precedent, that local DAs that don't like former President Biden could indict him?
I'm not going to comment from here.
Why don't you have more to say about the Trump indictment?
It is an ongoing case, and I've been very clear about that. We've been prudent about that, not commenting on ongoing cases, and we're going to stick to that. Peter?
And there were some further questions after that about why they'll talk about January 6th, which is still something that there's ongoing litigation surrounding, and they said that was just different. So they are continuing their strategy. It is obviously a deliberate strategy not to talk about this, and not because of the political angle, but mostly just because it is an ongoing case, Martha.
Okay, Peter, thank you very much. Peter Doocy at the White House. We do have some new images to share with you from inside the courtroom. As you know, there were no live cameras allowed in there. We do just have still photos of the proceedings here. The president just sitting at the desk, the defendant's desk, surrounded by his attorneys who we mentioned before. Bill Barr, you know, you have your own experience with this president. When you look at these pictures and he has been arrested and indicted and is in this courtroom, what goes through your mind on a personal level?
Well, as people know, I've had my differences with the president, but this situation, I think, he's being unjustly treated, just as he was by the Russiagate scam and the whole idea of the resistance. So I feel bad that this has happened. I don't think it's justified. And so at that very human level, I feel bad for him.
What about these attorneys, and what about the choice to bring in Todd Blanche, who people see on the left-hand side of the screen? We're getting a couple different images in here. As I said, very limited ability to take any photos in there. He left Cadwalader, his firm where he was a partner. He said he could not, something along the lines of, I couldn't pass up the opportunity to do this, to handle this. Why do you think he says that?
Because he hasn't worked with Trump before. Lawyers,
you think he'll be sorry? Is that what you're saying?
Lawyers inevitably are sorry for taking on assignments with him. They either spend a lot of time before grand juries or depositions themselves, or...
All right, we're just watching him come out of the room here and back into that hallway. So this process is over. We should expect that we're going to see in detail the list of this indictment. Nothing that we've heard so far indicates that there's any big bombshell here. We were told that this was going to be very solid. We were told by Lanny Davis, Michael Cohen's attorney, that we were going to be surprised by some of what we saw here, that there were more crimes than people know in this case. So we're watching to see if we will hear from the former president as he makes his way out of the building, and we wait for this. Andy McCarthy is back with us. Andy, so we wait now for the actual text of these indictments. Your thoughts on where we are at this moment?
Well, for all the people, Martha, who said, you know, you don't know what's in this indictment, we have to wait to see it. It's pretty much, from the way it's been described, what we heard it was. And I think that we should have all of the fright about that we've expressed so far. As I read the New York statute, you know, former Attorney General Barr has made a great point about whether they have sufficient evidence even to win on the misdemeanor. I would just point out, with respect to the felony, which requires showing not only that the misdemeanor was committed, but it was done with the intent to conceal another crime, I think the only sensible way that statute can be read is that another crime means another New York crime. This is from the New York Penal Code, and if that's not the way to interpret it, which is to say that another crime has to be another New York crime, and instead it opens it up to any crime, then my question is, what's the limiting principle of that? They say, you know, now they want to use it to bootstrap a federal crime in. Why not a crime against Sharia? You know, why not a crime against the law of Germany? It doesn't make any sense to interpret that provision any other way than to say he's got to have been trying to conceal a New York crime. So I think, as a matter of law, Bragg does not have jurisdiction to enforce federal campaign finance law, and that's just the legal problems. The practical proof problem is that he'd have to show that Trump knew he had committed another crime, and even the federal regulators of campaign finance can't agree on what is an in-kind contribution. In the Edwards case, the Federal Election Commission and the Department of Justice disagreed on that question, and they're the experts here. So I don't think he can prove it. I don't think he gets in the door legally, and if he could get in the door, I don't think he can make the case evidence-wise.
Yeah, if that's the case, and I'm going to ask Bill Barr to weigh in too on this, Andy. I mean, if that's the case, and you're Judge Mershon, how do you allow this to go forward? If that is, you know, if the secondary crime, which has to be in place in order to prove that there was some manipulation going on here, that you were trying to obfuscate these business records with intent to do something harmful, how can he allow it to go forward if that's the case?
Well, I was in the middle of saying why this lawyer from Cadwalader would take the case.
Yes.
And the other reason why, one reason he would take it is because at the end of the day, it's going to be a winner. And at some point, someone will, who isn't infected by the craziness of our age, is going to come in and straighten this thing out at some level of the judiciary, even if it goes into the federal appellate system. And since it all turns on a federal criminal statute, I think it would ultimately come to that. So at some point, some judge is going to stand up and do what's right here. I hope it's the first judge.
Now, would he indicate in any way, let's just assume for a moment that he looks at this and sees what you're saying. Would he have indicated in any way to the DA, look, when this happens, there's a chance that I might dismiss this thing, or would they not have any conversation about it at all? How would that work?
That's one to ask Judge Pirro, I mean, about the inner workings of the New York system, but or maybe
Andy. Andy, would there be any communication between Judge Mershon and Alvin Bragg about the tenuousness of this charge, if you guys are laying it out correctly?
It really depends on the judge, Martha. Some of them are, you know, very active and very involved and energetic from the get-go. Others will basically do nothing more today than perhaps set a schedule for discovery and future motions. If I'm Trump's lawyers, what I would be arguing for today is that even if there has to be a motion schedule that gets projected into the future so that sometime down the road you can have the conventional motions to, you know, quash evidence or limit things that the jury gets to hear, in the early stages, I would want an opportunity forthwith to make a motion to dismiss these charges on their face, on the very points that we're describing here, which is whether the district attorney had jurisdiction to bring these felony counts, and assuming I win on that, with respect to the misdemeanor counts, aren't they already time barred? Because the misdemeanor, remember, is just a 2-year statute of limitations. He needs to make this a felony even to get into the ballpark of having a 5-year statute of limitations, which I think he may barely be able to get into under these circumstances.
Yeah, honestly, the way you guys are describing this, it just seems so tenuous and, as you said, pathetically weak, Bill. Yeah. I mean, I'm just trying to figure out what's going on here. I mean, Alvin Bragg has had other successful cases. He's the district attorney. We all know he's been out to get Trump. But, you know, why would he lay himself out on the line this far with this kind of case if he doesn't have, and, you know, we were told, oh, wait till you see it. And we haven't seen it yet. We're still waiting. I'm still waiting for this to drop into our system. Why would he do this, Bill?
I don't know. I don't know why he would do it. But obviously, we've been saying all along that politics has had a lot to do with this. He campaigned on going after Trump. And maybe he views himself as delivering on that promise.
All right, we are watching this. And anybody in the control room with an eagle eye on where they're going right now? Are they going straight to the airport or? Okay, going straight to LaGuardia. So we did not hear from the president. We thought we might on his way out of the courthouse, but we do expect that we will hear from him this evening from Mar-a-Lago once he gets back home to Florida, which is now his main residence. And Alvin Bragg is going to speak any moment now. And won't it be interesting to hear how he backs up this indictment, which Andy McCarthy and the former Attorney General Bill Barr have both basically taken a scalpel to and say that there's not much there at all. So we'll see what Alvin Bragg, the DA, has to say about how he handles this. Do we still have Britt with us, guys? Okay. Britt, you know, politically, we didn't hear from the president just now. We know that he loves to stop and talk to the cameras. He did, as I said, look extremely serious and somber when he walked into that courtroom. He's been through an experience today that nobody wants to go through. No matter how you play this or try to spin it to your advantage, it has to be a humiliating experience in many ways for him, but he's going to try to make this work to his benefit. What do you expect to hear from him tonight, Britt?
I think my guess is, knowing him, as we all do from seeing so much of him, that he'll be pretty defiant, and you know, he will be saying onward and forward. We're going to make America great again. This isn't going to deter me. It's a flimsy charge brought for political reasons. His supporters will be there in some number, and they will cheer him lustily, and life will go on much as it did before all this, with the exception that, as we all know, something historic and undesirable has happened.
So, as I said, thank you, Britt. We're waiting for the DA to step in front of the microphone. We also understand that Jake Gibson, who is our producer, who was inside the room and who we are looking forward to hearing from about the demeanor of the former president and everything that went down in there, and also this list of the actual indictment with these 34 counts, that he's going to get in front of the camera for us shortly as well. So we look forward to that. But here is the president's motorcade as it heads back. And clearly, Britt, you know, this is a moment, as you say, it will pass. Other things will take precedent. But he's the center of attention now in a way that he hasn't been since he started this campaign, Britt.
Yeah, I know, but I guarantee you, no matter what people say, this isn't how he would like to establish himself anew as the center of our attention of our politics. No matter how flimsy the charges, and from all that our legal analysts have indicated, it looks pretty flimsy, this case. Nonetheless, it's, you know, you don't want to go into the courtroom and be arraigned and stand there at the mercy of some judge and possibly later a jury, and with a prosecutor out to get you. You just don't want that. Look, I've been a defendant in a couple of lawsuits, and I'll tell you, they turned out fine, but it was no fun. And I guarantee you, today was no fun for Donald Trump.
Yeah, no doubt. Bill?
I agree, yeah.
It's hard to spin it into a positive moment, and no doubt, as Britt says, that the president will do his best to be defiant when he speaks tonight at Mar-a-Lago about this, but it also has to be, Bill, hanging over him that this is just the very beginning. There are several other cases in the pipeline.
Right, and that's why I don't think this is necessarily going to fade. There's going to be re-upping of this on a consistent basis, I think. You know, I feel bad about what's happened to the office of the president over the last few years with all this turmoil. I mean, his advisors have been ordered now to appear before the January 6th prosecutor and so forth. So the powers of the presidency have been eroded by these cases over the last few years.
That's a good point. So Mark Meadows will have to testify, Mike Pence to some degree. The Vice President of the United States will also have to testify about January 6th. As you say, that's an erosion of the executive power, something that you've always spoken of very strongly in terms of the importance of preserving that. So what's lost when you have advisors who may be going to work for this president or the next president who know that they might be forced into this situation as well now as a precedent here?
Right. It'll have a tremendous chilling effect on robust conversations and give and take debates within the executive branch, and that'll lead to worse government.
So we watch as the motorcade makes its way now to LaGuardia Airport. You know, this is all going to play out, Britt, over the course of the next several months, while the rest of us are covering this election, doing debate I mean, what's the impact of this on a debate environment? If you're on stage with this former president and he's facing several indictments, how do you deal with that if you are, you know, potentially DeSantis or any of these other candidates?
That's a very good question politically, because it goes to the larger question of how do you deal with Donald Trump if you're trying to beat him and at the same time possibly hang on to the allegiance in a general election of his hardcore of support. And that has been the problem facing the Republican Party now for several cycles. And here we are again, Martha. So you've got this controversial president, hated by many, loved by some. And you need his supporters not to turn away from you should you eclipse him, should you beat him. So how do you address these issues? How do you address all the controversy and all the things that have made him less attractive than he might otherwise be? Do you take him on directly? You know, there's a long history in politics of candidates being taken down by attacks from other candidates. But the beneficiary of those attacks is not normally the person doing the attacking. It's usually somebody else.
Yes,
as we
it's
saw
a great
with,
point.
You know, Chris Christie takes on Marco Rubio. If it didn't help Christie, it didn't help Rubio. Who did it help? It ended up helping Donald Trump.
You're so right. Let's go straight to Jake Gibson and Brian Yennis. Jake was in the courtroom and he has the indictment. Jake and Brian, what can you tell us?
All right, Martha, Jake Gibson is the Department of Justice producer. Jake, what can you tell us about the charges in the indictment?
So 34 charges. They're felony charges for falsifying business records in New York. And then also within that, using those records to help suppress a story that may have done damage to his campaign. Those are the charges, 34 of them. Mr. Trump walked in, former President Trump walked in. He seemed to have a bit of a swagger. He looked stoic. He looked stone-faced. He pled not guilty. He said not guilty. At some point, the prosecution brought up all of the social media posts that he has put out recently, including the one where he's holding a bat next to DA Bragg. And the prosecution said this is could be looked at as inciting violence, and they wanted Judge Merchan to. It seemed like they wanted him to give a gag order. Justice Merchan said that no, he wouldn't give a gag order, but he said to Mr. Trump and to his attorneys, I don't want to see this anymore. I don't want to see the next time that I see something like this, I might have a different idea about what I should do. His attorney said that, look, this case they've been investigating this for 3 years. There's been selective leaks that are harming former President Trump, and it's unthinkable that he wouldn't be allowed to defend himself. That is their way of justifying his posts. The judge said that he wasn't sure that justified, if he was inciting violence, right? Later, the prosecution also said that there was a conflict of interest with defense attorney Tacopino, that they just received a letter from Stormy Daniels' lawyer wherein they say that he had communications with her, and that's a conflict of interest. Tacopino said that no, that he had never met with her, had never spoken with her, that she called his office looking to hire him, spoke to a paralegal, but he never took her off, he never took her as a client, so that shouldn't be a conflict of interest. Very interestingly, the prosecution wants this to go to trial in January of 2024, and you know what else is in January of 2024 is primary season for the presidential election. Former President Trump's team didn't want anything to do with that. They want to push it further out. However, the judge said, I would like to move expeditiously. There will be motions on both sides. Defense motions will come next, and then the prosecution will have a response. On December 4th, there will be another hearing here where the judge will give his decision on the motions, okay? So that's the next time we have something here, December 4th, in person. President Trump's team, hinted that maybe they didn't want him to come to that hearing. And the judge said it's good if he would come to these hearings. A jury eventually, if there is a trial, would want to see him. And the defense said, right, but think of all the money that was spent with this today, and how much the burden this put on the city. And the judge seemed to agree that it was a serious burden, but that he still thought that Mr. Trump should attend. And he denied their request that maybe if he didn't want to attend the December 4th hearing. He said maybe in the future we could let him out of one, but I'd like to see him at the December 4th hearing.
A ton of information. Martha, you can come in at any moment with a question, but I just want to kind of wrap up what you were saying. So the former president will have his next hearing on December 4th here in Manhattan.
Correct.
There was the talk of the gag order. Judge Merchan was not interested in doing that because he did not think that it was an incitement of violence, the post from the former president.
What he said is, I'm requesting that you don't do that. It's a request at this point. It's not an order. It's a request.
That he stay off of social media.
That he not do things that might be looked as inciting some type of violence, or getting having something that would end up with a protest where someone could be hurt. And he said, now, I'm not going to impose a gag order now. However, if, the prosecution showed the judge the post, they gave him printed copies of them, and he was looking at them, and he said, and if I see these, if I get this passed to me again, I might have a different idea about this. And this is how it works in a lot of trials. Judges consider a gag order to be a pretty severe order. And so he didn't, it seemed like, want to go out there already on the first hearing on arraignment day and go that far.
And it seems like this had to deal with Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal. Is that right?
I didn't hear the name Karen McDougal, but we did hear the name Stormy Daniels. We definitely, her name was mentioned in court today.
Okay. Martha.
Yeah, Brian, quick question. So that's significant, I think, because one of the things that we were looking to potentially intensify this presentation of this indictment was that we heard David Pecker involved in 2 hearings, and he came back at the end and thought maybe the Karen McDougal's part of the story was going to kind of put some more substance behind this, but it sounds like that's not the case. And so the judge says he wants to move, fairly quickly, and the next hearing isn't until December 4th. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, no, you heard that right. So he wants to move fairly quickly, but the next hearing isn't until December 4th.
Because there will be motions. I think it's September 19th. In August, there are the motions that the defense can file, and then the prosecution has to respond by September 19th, and then the next hearing would be December 4th. And it is quite a ways off, yes.
Did the defense show their cards on the types of motions that they're going to file? For instance, change of venue. Was there a motion to dismiss the case outright?
Change of venue was not mentioned. However, when the prosecution laid out, or they talked about a little bit of the background of the charges and launched into a bit of an attack about Mr. Trump's what he's been saying over social media, the defense attorney got up and said, I didn't know we were doing opening statements today. I didn't know, he seemed to be taking a jab at them that I thought this was an arraignment day, not, you're going to give us your whole opening statement.
Okay, so defense didn't want to show their cards clearly and get into that kind of detail at this time. And Martha, you had mentioned David Pecker. We have a press release, and I'm sure you have it as well, from the DA Alvin Bragg that goes over some of these counts, and it does talk about AMI, which was American Media Company. David Pecker was the witness who was brought into the grand jury, correct? And he testified twice, as you mentioned, Martha, and he was accused of catch for kill. Essentially, he was the person who was the intermediary between him and Michael Cohen, the former president's personal attorney, to pay Karen McDougal $150,000. And that instance of the $150,000 payment is mentioned in the DA's press release describing these payments and describing these, these felony counts. So it does appear that Karen McDougal is at the basis of this, and David Pecker, who was interviewed multiple times by the grand jury, as well as Michael Cohen and Stormy Daniels. Jake, do you have anything else you'd like to offer us before we send it back over to Martha?
I think it's worth noting, I think I brought it up already, but I may not have, that President Trump, former President Trump, definitely glared at the DA Bragg when he left. He seemed to get up, look around the room, because he walked in. Trump was the last one to walk in the hearing, and this was pretty intense. I mean, it's not a huge room, but there's probably 50 reporters in there. There were 15, 20, 25 law enforcement officials that were on the end of each row. So we couldn't really see that well because they're standing up in front, so we can't really see up there. What you really saw well was him enter the room and leave the room. There was Secret Service agents in there. There were the court police. There were just a lot of police in there, and they were very strict with the press. We will kick you out of here. We see a phone, we'll kick you out. People would try to sit up a little bit to look, sit down. I think this was a very serious, it was very intense in there.
What was the judge's tone when he was? Did he admonish the former president or his lawyers?
No, Judge Merchan was very measured. There was not. He did not show his. He did not seem to have any beef with President Trump. I think he went out of his way to make sure that he was showing everyone that he could be very fair about this.
Jake Gibson, thank you. Incredible job in there. Thank you. Martha, back to you.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you so much, Jake Gibson and Brian Yennis. Let's see if we can hear some of this. This is the Trump attorneys who are taking some questions. Watch. The back of Joe Tacopina there, and Todd Blanche is next to him. They were sort of chuckling a moment ago about something. We couldn't hear exactly what they were saying. Bill Barr's watching all this with me, and he is going through the indictment, which we're told does not really have a lot of surprises in it. What do you think, Bill?
Well, it doesn't have any surprises, except they never really specify what the crime was that was being concealed. It's very repetitive. It's what we would refer to as stacking. Every document is cited as a specific felony, and it just says that he caused a false record, and he did it with the intent to conceal another crime, period. It doesn't really get into the theory of the case.
So it doesn't say that the other crime created a federal election issue?
They don't say that, no. But so they have some optionality, I guess, to figure out what the crime is that was being concealed, but they never really specify it.
Does that seem odd to you?
It seems a little odd to me, but I don't know what the practice is in that court.
It's very vague.
Yeah.
That's fair to say. And that the whole underpinning of this, as we've understood it, is that if you are falsifying a business record in order to cover up something else that's a crime, that's a crime. In the worst case scenario, Bill, let's say that they can prove that happened. What's the punishment?
I think for a felony, this felony, it's up to 5 years, I think, in New York.
And is there a history of people serving 5 years for this kind of violation?
I doubt it. I think probably they'd get a suspended sentence.
And if it's a person who's never had any crime on their record before, does that?
Especially if there's no victims, if there are no defrauded victims, it's hard to see what the basis would be for sentencing someone to time in prison. After all, this is a DA. He doesn't like putting people in prison.
No, he doesn't. He likes to put them right back out on the street, which sadly we've seen time and time again, even when people were stabbed in some cases, sexual assault in other cases, they have been released after very little time under Alvin Bragg. So that's something for people to think about in the city. Bill Hemmer is standing by, watching all of this with us. Bill, you and I started our day out together as we watched the beginning of this process. Your thoughts on all of it as you have covered it with us this afternoon.
Listening to Britt talk about a flimsy case a moment ago, Martha, and thinking about you and me together at noon on Friday. If you recall, we set the story up by saying, what's changed? Bragg's been in office since January 1st, 2022. He's had access to all this information ever since then. So what has changed over the course of the past, what are we, April now? 15 some odd months. And the one thing that's changed is that they got a conviction in December against the Trump organization. And then a fine was issued in mid-January to the tune of $1.6 million. And it was toward the end of the month where Bragg sat a grand jury, and in all likelihood, Martha, he may have thought, wow, if this case over the period of 6 weeks' time was this easy to get a conviction, I can go forward with the jury in New York City on the Stormy Daniels matter. Now, based on everything that we know, that's about the only thing that has changed over the past 15 months. I'd be curious to know what Andy McCarthy thinks about that, or even Bill Barr. I want to pass one thing on to you. Eric Trump today at 2:15, when his father was inside the courtroom, moments before he came to the door, then went down and sat before the judge, he sent this message to me. He said, Alvin Bragg has shut down the entire city, called up 38,000 NYPD police officers, closed down the FDR, which is the highway in the east side of Manhattan, and are spending an estimated $200 million of city funds for a $130,000 NDA, non-disclosure agreement. I never thought I would see this political corruption in our country. And then he said, you can quote me on that. A moment ago, he shared that on Twitter as well. And so that is some reaction that we're getting from the Trump family. With regard to some other Republicans, I reached out to Chris Christie. Let me see if I can find this here. I was texting him a bit earlier today. He said an incredible day for Trump. He has both dreaded this day and probably can't believe he is actually here, which I think a lot of people on the Trump circle would probably agree with, especially that last comment there. Martha, this is the book written by Mark Pomerantz that was published about a month ago, all right? He was the attorney who retired to his home in Connecticut, age 70, was planning his wife's 70th birthday, was given a call by Cy Vance, who is the former DA in New York County, which Alvin Bragg now has the job. He was given a call by Cy Vance to be an outside observer for the Trump-related matters in the DA's office. And Pomerantz is looking through this book. He makes a very interesting case about real estate holdings in New York. And Martha, we were on the air earlier today, and everybody had a theory about this, okay? Now we know because we've seen the indictment. Your theory that it would be more pertaining to the payments with Stormy Daniels. And I was thinking, wow, you think about that leak last night at 8:37 p.m., where Yahoo News was reporting, and there's a good question for the DA here. How did Yahoo News get this information that 34 felony counts would be leveled against President Trump today? That was supposed to be all secret in a sealed indictment. And that's when I started thinking more and more about this case that Pomerantz laid out. Now, he resigned because Bragg did not take up his matter. And again, a lot of this deals with real estate, how you value it. Is it undervalued so you can get yourself a break from the IRS, or is it overvalued so you can inflate your own self-worth? I am told, and Pomerantz talks about this in the book, he says, this is how real estate magnates in New York City work. And the attorneys in the office came back and told Pomerantz, he said, this is just the way business is done in New York. And he made the argument, no, we have to stop that. And the way you do that is you make an example out of one person, and he was making the argument that that person should be Donald Trump. He lost that argument. And now it's clear from the indictment that all that, the majority of his work that he was doing inside the Southern District of New York was passed up by Alvin Bragg. And he chose this case on Stormy Daniels instead. And we'll see whether or not over time, a year plus, I would say, Martha, before we get close to any resolution. But I would say, Martha, when Bragg speaks, a reporter needs to ask, what changed? And I think that should be the first question.
It's a good question. Bill, thank you very much. You know, just getting some feedback from people who have worked in this DA's office. They're saying this is a pathetic, very weak, very thin gruel. Choose your adjectives pretty much across the board is the reaction now that people have dug into this. It's a very sort of boilerplate document that, you know, sort of sets up a situation where there is a payment that's made and then it's to cover up something else, but it doesn't really get into the details of what that was or why that would be a crime. And I just think you're going to have a lot of people, and you hear the argument being made on the Trump side that that this is just not worth it, just not worth the money, just not worth the time, and the manpower that it takes up in this office where you have a lot of criminal situations that they seem to be ignoring. That's the argument that you're going to hear on the part of some folks in New York as they look at all of this. Others will be in the camp where they are, you know, we've seen a lot of glee over the past several days that the former president was indicted. So Andy McCarthy, we're watching the motorcade as it makes its way to LaGuardia. You know, your thoughts on what Bill lays out, that there was some substance here, but we don't seem to have gotten it.
Well, I think, Martha, the way Attorney General Barr describes it, I'd be curious about whether that's not in and of itself a motion to dismiss the indictment. You know, the purpose of an indictment in the criminal law is twofold. It's to put the defendant on notice of exactly what's charged, and it's to give him an ability to raise double jeopardy if anyone ever tries to charge him with it again. So in order for the pleading, for the indictment to be sufficient, it's got to lay out the charge so that he knows what he's being charged with. If they've withheld, if they've concealed the crime that he's supposed to have concealed, then they haven't laid out what the charge is. You have to put them on enough notice with the four corners of the indictment that they know exactly what they're accused of what laws they're accused of violating. And if they're hiding the ball about what it is that they're claiming that Trump concealed because they know that they don't have jurisdiction to enforce federal law, I think that in and of itself would be fatal to the prosecution.
Yeah, Bill is nodding his head too. I mean, that's why I'm asking about this Judge Marchand. He's also on the line here. So if he looks at this and says, look, you didn't establish the connection between this payment, this hush money payment, which people unfortunately do all the time, and some larger crime, why would this judge want to have that on his plate as having said, okay, let's go forward with this?
That's right. And I commend him for his initial decision on the gag order. And
thank you.
And I hope he continues to bring that kind of scrutiny to this case. But Andy, when I look through this, it's just a repetition of the same sentence for each count, that the defendant on or about such and such a date with intent to defraud and intent to commit another crime and aid and conceal the commission thereof, made and caused a false entry to wit, and then it states some false entry. But I don't see any discussion of the facts surrounding what was the second crime that was committed, and how did this relate to that?
Yeah, that may be why we saw, so we were watching the Trump attorneys, there was like a lot of laughter. They may have been laughing at the contents of this, and that's what you're hearing on the Trump side as well, that that there's no surprises in here and zero meat on the bones in terms of what they're pointing to. It seems like they could have put that indictment together months ago based on, what it looks like. It's not like there's a ton of investigation details that have been revealed here today. So that's where we are as we watch this motorcade. We watched it arrive yesterday, and now the former president is on his way back home to Mar-a-Lago. We thought we might hear from him at a couple of points today. We did not. My guess is that he's anxious to be wheels up and headed back to Mar-a-Lago with this episode behind him, at least for now. There will be motions, and we're just that podium that you're looking at there is where Alvin Bragg is going to come out. And boy, I think we're going to be very interested to hear what he has to say about why he's bringing this case and what the substance of it is. He is clearly on the line with this and has stuck his neck out to move forward with this indictment of a former president, never been done before. So I think there's going to be a lot of questions about exactly why he decided to pursue this case against the former president. And we will hear from the Manhattan DA, Alvin Bragg, just moments away. Thanks for being with us today, everybody. That is the story for this Tuesday. My thanks to former Attorney General Bill Barr and Andy McCarthy and everybody here. We'll see you tomorrow.
All right, we are waiting to hear from Alvin Bragg, the prosecutor, of course, who brought this 34-count indictment against the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, moments ago, pleading not guilty to those 34 charges, largely focused on falsifying business records. All of this going down a few minutes ago at the Manhattan Criminal Court. The president is returning right now to LaGuardia Airport. He will fly back to Florida at his Mar-a-Lago compound in Palm Beach. We understand that he is still going to make comments on this later this evening. We don't know in what form, whether he'll answer questions, make a speech, a combination therein. He is going to speak. The judge did not issue a gag order here on any of this, but had advised him to watch his social media use ahead of hearing from Alvin Bragg, and that could happen any minute. I do want to go to Brian Yennis right now with what went down in there. And again, courtesy Jake Gibson as well, who was in that courtroom to find out exactly what transpired. Brian.
Neil, yeah, we'll begin right now just on the indictment. What we now know before DA Alvin Bragg speaks is that these are 34 felony counts for falsifying business records in New York. And in the indictment, the first line reads, the defendant, Donald J. Trump, repeatedly and fraudulently falsified New York business records to conceal criminal conduct that hid damaging information from the voting public during the 2016 presidential election. Those are the counts and it goes on and on at this point. We're still kind of sifting through it. We're going to hear more from the DA Bragg. Let's bring in Jake Gibson. He is a Department of Justice producer for us at the Fox News Channel. He was inside the courtroom. Jake, run us through again just what it was like to be in there. Well, tell me what you know about the counts and the indictment from what you heard in there.
We know there's 34 counts, and we know that they have to do with fraud on business dealings in New York, and that they're upped him to a felony because they're saying that he did that in furtherance of his campaign to hide these alleged hush payments to Stormy Daniels, and that is therefore how they get the rationale to get to a felony. Right. Mr. Trump said audibly not guilty when asked.
So, yeah, he was asked by the judge, Juan Merchan, how do you plead to the 34 counts? And he said,
not guilty.
Okay, how do you describe the two big motions that happened inside? One was the gag order. The other one was about the timing of this case. Let's start off with the gag order.
The gag order is interesting because the prosecution is saying, look, these are some incendiary communications and posts that former President Trump has put out there that could incite violence. And we want you to do something about it to the judge.
Prosecution handed over to Judge Juan Merchan
actual printouts of posts from former President Trump. I think probably the one where he's holding the baseball bat, because that did come up. They brought that up, that there's a post where he's holding a baseball bat near DA Bragg, okay? And then they passed in these things. And Judge Merchan said he talked about the rhetoric, and he said the charged nature of these posts, and he said, please, he said, I'm making a request. It's not an order at this point. I'm making a request of you and your client, to his defense attorneys and to former President Trump. Refrain from making comments that could incite violence or conduct that could jeopardize the rule of law. I'm asking you to do this. And if, at this point I'm not making an order, but if I saw a post like this in front of me again, I might think about that. Right? So that's one major thing that happened in there. And then the other is the timing you're talking about, right? Right. The prosecution said that they would like a trial in January of 2024, which for all of us who watch politics intently it would be just amazing, because there we are in the heat of the presidential primaries there. We're talking about Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and the idea that Mr. Trump, former President Trump, would have to come to court every day when he wants to be campaigning every day. That must be a real, that's probably a non-starter for him, right?
What did his defense say about when they want to come to court?
They said they wanted as much time as they could get. They didn't even specify a time. What they said was, look, we got this indictment a half hour ago. Give us time to read the indictment. You're talking about a court date. You're talking about starting a trial. We haven't even read the indictment. And as I said earlier, as I was telling you, one of his defense attorneys took a jab at the prosecution and said, I didn't know we were doing opening statements today, because they were laying out some of their complaints about Mr. Trump, and the defense is like, hey, that's a lot. You know, I thought this was just an arraignment here.
So ultimately, they landed on the first court appearance, and this will be an appearance. Former President Trump will have to come to court on December 4th.
That was how Judge Merchan ruled at the end, and Mr. Trump's defense attorneys said that they might not want him. Maybe he doesn't want to attend. Does he have to attend? And they brought up the intense burden that this has put on the city of New York and the intense expense that this has put on the city of New York. And Judge Merchan said, no, I understand that. I understand that the expense and the burden. However, I think that he should come to this hearing. And maybe we'll talk about other hearings down the road that he doesn't have to come to. But this one he should be at.
We're about to listen to DA Alvin Bragg have his press conference. Let's talk a little bit more about demeanor. You said that the former president glared at DA Bragg.
He when he walked in, he seemed to swagger. He seemed like a man who, you know, was getting in a fight or something. You know, he was stone-faced. I looked right at him. I had a great kind of edge seat. You know, I looked right at him, and he was stone-faced, you know, and walked slowly. And he was the last one in the room. The security in there was intense. There's at least 25 law enforcement officials, you know, threatening to kick us out if we use our phones, threatening to kick us out if we try to get up and leave, or if we even move around. And everyone was there except he was the last guy to enter that room, and he took his time. He walked slowly to his seat, and then when the hearing was over, a lot of the hearing we couldn't see because not only were there all these officers in there, but they all remained standing. So, you know, you're peering around them trying to see, and you can't see. You can just maybe get a glimpse of the back of Mr. Trump's head. When he got up, we were able to see him. We still had to remain seated, but we could see him, and he seemed to look around to gauge the room and then lock his eyes on Alvin Bragg, and he seemed to kind of glare at him.
And did Bragg glare back?
I think they locked eyes. You know, I didn't get a clear look at Bragg because it was the back of his head, because Trump at that point was standing. You know,
Juan Merchan, how would you describe the justice's demeanor in there?
He said that I want to move forward expeditiously, but he didn't seem to be overtly hostile towards Mr. Trump. As you know, we've seen Mr. Trump say that judge hates me. I think maybe Justice Merchan was aware of that and really wanted to make sure that you know, the defense couldn't say, look at you, you're, you know, overtly hostile towards my client. He definitely was a cool character.
And finally, you've done this a pretty long time, Jake. How would you describe the experience you just had inside that courtroom?
Well, it's unprecedented, right? We've never had one of these before, a president in an indictment. So I just felt really lucky to be in there, and thanks for talking to me about it.
I appreciate you, Jake. You were absolutely awesome. But let's wait to Neil. Do you have any questions for Mr. Jake Gibson here about what he experienced inside?
I do, and it's maybe just more informational than anything else, Brian, but if you can ask Jake, I mean, was there an understanding from the judge, even though he didn't issue a gag order, that he doesn't want Donald Trump on Truth Social, or to limit his statements on Truth Social, his preferred social media site for communication? Does that extend to remarks he's planning to make tonight out of Mar-a-Lago?
Right. What does this extend, do you think, based on what you heard in there? Did the judge say stay off of Truth Social? Did the judge, in your opinion, say don't make remarks, for instance, tonight at Mar-a-Lago? How far do you think the request came from the justice?
No, I don't think so, because the defense brought up that this is his First Amendment right to defend himself, and that this investigation's been going on for years, and what they allege are selective leaks that are coming out that are damaging to Mr. Trump, and why shouldn't he be able to defend himself? So I think what the judge was saying is he never said don't do a press conference. He definitely didn't say that. What he said was, I don't want to see stuff that could incite violence. So I think he wanted to tell him that you have your First Amendment rights to defend yourself and to speak freely, but not what I would rather not see is something that is going to cause violence out there or is going to hurt the rule of law. You know.
Okay. Neil.
All right, you answered that. Now, thank you guys very, very much. We're waiting for Alvin Bragg, the prosecutor, to come in. I've been picking apart through these 34 felony counts, and some of them, frankly, are redundant, but they all go back essentially to falsifying business records under something called Article 175 of the New York penal law. Now, you might be hearing this, and what does this have to do with a former president of the United States on a federal issue? Well, they're saying that falsifying business records, though a felony in New York, can extend to more severe crimes if there is an intent to defraud. That includes the intent to commit another crime or aid to conceal a crime already a crime. I know that sounds verbose. What it means is, though there are 34 felony counts here, each count really represents a separate instance of misconduct or something that you shouldn't be doing. It is not a distinct different crime. And that's important to emphasize here. You might notice this idea of redundancy, but most of these counts stemming back to payments to two women. I think you're familiar with the women by now, but this idea that they were, by making the payments and trying to get hush money, or that seems to be the implication here, that they were covering a crime with yet another crime and confusing people in the process. Now, if convicted on a felony bookkeeping fraud charges, which this is at its bare minimum is what the former president is facing, that could mean a sentence of up to 4 years in prison for each count. Now, that does not appear to be the direction this necessarily will go, but the charge doesn't carry any mandatory prison sentence. In other words, that isn't baked into the cake that you're found guilty on such a count or multiple counts that you're going to go to the big house. But even if convicted on all of those counts, in this case, a former president wouldn't necessarily be facing jail time. Says nothing about the kind of things that he would not be allowed to do. For example, nowhere in our Constitution does it bring up issues like this about what would keep you from holding office. All you have to be is, a legal and born citizen of this country and at least 35 years old. And that's it. It doesn't get into some of these nuances on crimes or alleged crimes or any of that. So what we're left with here is a sort of an indictment that confuses a lot of folks, Republicans by and large, saying these are trumped up charges, no pun intended there, about a lot of nothing that are repetitive and are repeating multiple incidents of sometimes the same crime looked another way. I know that gets to be confusing, but when you hear that 34 count, oftentimes you're hearing, oh my gosh, 34 different crimes. I want to go to David Spunt on this. We're waiting to hear from Alvin Bragg, but that's what it comes down to. A lot here, to put it mildly. I don't want to dismiss it, David, but not as much as would first appear to be the case, right?
Yeah, Neil, exactly. And, you hear 34 felonies and you think 34 separate felonies. We're going to go to D.A. Bragg right now.
I'm jumping on you, buddy. Alvin Bragg is talking right now. He's, of course, the prosecutor in this case.
Earlier this afternoon, Donald Trump was arraigned on a New York Supreme Court indictment returned by a Manhattan grand jury on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. Under New York state law, it is a felony to falsify business records with intent to defraud and an intent to conceal another crime. That is exactly what this case is about. 34 false statements made to cover up other crimes. These are felony crimes in New York State, no matter who you are. We cannot and will not normalize serious criminal conduct. The defendant repeatedly made false statements on New York business records. He also caused others to make false statements. The defendant claimed that he was paying Michael Cohen for legal services performed in 2017. This simply was not true. And it was a false statement that the defendant made month after month in 2017. April, May, June, and so on through the rest of the year. For 9 straight months, the defendant held documents in his hand containing this key lie, that he was paying Michael Cohen for legal services performed in 2017. And he personally signed checks for payments to Michael Cohen for each of these 9 months. In total, the grand jury found there were 34 documents with this critical false statement. Why did Donald Trump repeatedly make these false statements? The evidence will show that he did so to cover up crimes relating to the 2016 election. Donald Trump, executives at the publishing company American Media Incorporated, Mr. Cohen, and others agreed in 2015 to a catch and kill scheme. That is, a scheme to buy and suppress negative information to help Mr. Trump's chance of winning the election. As part of this scheme, Donald Trump and others made 3 payments to people who claimed to have negative information about Mr. Trump. To make these payments, they set up shell companies, and they made yet more false statements, including, for example, in AMI, American Media Incorporated's business records. One of the 3 people that they paid to keep quiet was a woman named Stormy Daniels. Less than 2 weeks before the presidential election, Michael Cohen wired $130,000 to Stormy Daniels' lawyer. That payment was to hide damaging information from the voting public. The participant scheme was illegal. The scheme violated New York election law, which makes it a crime to conspire to promote a candidacy by unlawful means. The $130,000 wire payment exceeded the federal campaign contribution cap, and the false statements in AMI's books violated New York law. That is why Mr. Trump made false statements about his payments to Mr. Cohen. He could not simply say that the payments were a reimbursement for Mr. Cohen's payments to Stormy Daniels. To do so, to make that true statement, would have been to admit a crime. So instead, Mr. Trump said that he was paying Mr. Cohen for fictitious legal services in 2017 to cover up actual crime committed the prior year. And in order to get Michael Cohen his money back, they planned one last false statement. In order to complete the scheme, they planned to mischaracterize the repayments to Mr. Cohen as income to the New York State tax authorities. The conduct I just described and that which was charged by the grand jury is felony criminal conduct in New York State. True and accurate business records are important everywhere, to be sure. They are all the more important in Manhattan, the financial center of the world. That is why we have a history in the Manhattan DA's office of vigorously enforcing white-collar crime. My office, including the talented prosecutors you saw at arraignment earlier today, has charged hundreds of felony falsifying business records. This charge, it can be said, is the bread and butter of our white-collar work. And fraud presents itself in all different forms here in Manhattan. We have charged falsifying business records for those who violated federal bank secrecy laws. We have charged falsifying business records for those who were seeking to cover up sex crimes. And we have brought this charge for those who committed tax violations. At its core, this case today is one with allegations like so many of our white-collar cases. Allegations that someone lied again and again to protect their interests and evade the laws to which we are all held accountable. As this office has done time and time again, we today uphold our solemn responsibility to ensure that everyone stands equal before the law. No amount of money and no amount of power changes that enduring American principle. I'll now take questions. We conducted a thorough and rigorous investigation, as we're known to do, at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. I've been doing this for 24 years and am no stranger to rigorous, complex investigations. I bring cases when they're ready. Having now conducted a rigorous, thorough investigation, the case was ready to be brought, and it was brought.
Mr. Bragg, the indictment says that there were 34 false business records. And they would then conceal another crime, but the indictment does not specifically say what those crimes were. We are assuming, perhaps, that they might be election-related. I'm wondering if you can specify what laws were also broken.
Right. So let me say as an initial matter that the indictment doesn't specify that because the law does not so require. In my remarks, I mentioned a couple of laws, which I will highlight again now. The first is New York State election law, which makes it a crime to conspire to promote a candidacy by unlawful means. I further indicated a number of unlawful means, including more additional false statements, including statements that were planned to be made to tax authorities. I also noted the federal election law cap on contribution limits.
But why weren't there those crimes charged? Why wasn't he charged with those crimes?
Well, I'm not going to go into our deliberative process on what was brought. The charges that were brought were the ones that were brought. The evidence in the law is the basis for those decisions.
You had expressed a year ago that you had some reservations about the case's readiness. Can you talk to us about what were some of the questions in your mind that needed to be answered in order to bring a case of this magnitude?
I'm not going to go chapter and verse into any thinking. What I will say is, I believe the time period you're talking about, I'd been in office for a couple of months. The investigation, in my view, was not concluded into the conduct in particular that is the basis for the charges today. Since that time, we've had more evidence made available to the office and opportunity to meet with additional witnesses. So, as I said earlier, I've been doing this for 24 years. I don't bring cases prior to a thorough and rigorous investigation. Now, having done so, the case has been brought.
Mr. Bragg, Garrett Hake with NBC News. Your predecessor took a hard look at this case and decided not to charge it. Federal prosecutors took a hard look at this case and decided not to charge it. Do you believe you have new evidence that led you to decide to charge this, or why now?
Well, as I just mentioned, we have had available to the office additional evidence that was not in the office's possession prior to my time here. And as to your part of your question about the federal, we have a distinct and strong, I would say profound, independent interest in New York State. This is the business capital of the world. We regularly do cases involving false business statements. The bedrock, in fact, the basis for business integrity and a well-functioning business marketplace is true and accurate record keeping. That's the charge that's brought here, falsifying New York State business records. I'm not going to go beyond the plain language statement of facts, which I think speaks for itself. So the charge is falsifying business records. The charge requires, as I specified, criminal conduct that was concealed. One of the concealed crimes we allege is New York State election law. I went through in our statement of facts, which I think many of you have in front of you, goes through things including text messages, emails, contemporaneous phone records, multiple witnesses. All of that will be, as you saw in the fall, borne out in a public courtroom in downtown Manhattan. I'm glad you put your finger on that, because it's not just about one payment. It is 34 business records 34 false statements in business records. They were concealing criminal conduct. The earlier question about New York State election law, when I talked about conspiracy to promote a candidacy by unlawful means. Those unlawful means, we allege, include the conduct set forth in the statement of facts, which is additional false statements separate and apart from the charged ones in AMI documents, planned false statements to taxing authorities. It is not just that one $130,000 wire payment. Thanks so much.
Any comment about any incitement of violence by former president?
At what point do you think that order is necessary?
All right, Alvin Bragg laying out his case that this is different than the case that was rejected by Cyrus Vance, the district attorney of New York before him, and the Federal Election Commission that saw no there and didn't want to pursue this case. He opted otherwise, and hence this 34-count indictment that largely stems from alleged 2016 hush money payments, but there's a lot of duplication here. I want to get into this a little bit more with David Spund, who I rudely interrupted by going to this presser. Thought it important to do so. But David, looking at these charges, there is a lot of redundancy here, and there's not a lot of whole new here. What are you getting a sense of?
Well, first of all, no problem, because Alvin Bragg is a huge newsmaker today. But, Neil, what's curious is that, this specific
So that was Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg laying out the case against former President Donald Trump after history was made in a Manhattan courtroom. The former president of the United States entering a not guilty plea to 34 felony counts. We have not heard from Mr. Trump yet. We do expect that later in the evening. For the latest on this story, stay with this Fox station in Washington. I'm Mike Emanuel.
This has been a Fox News special report.